What remains of two ships that destroyed each other in the darkness, now resting on the ocean floor thousands of meters below, where no light reaches and the water holds its secrets in absolute silence. It is November in the Indian Ocean, that vast and mostly forgotten expanse of water that stretches between the coasts of Western Australia and the distant shores of Africa. The sun is sinking low toward the horizon, painting the water in shades of amber and deepening orange. The waves roll in long, patient swells, the sound of them almost rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. There is no land visible in any direction, no ships on the horizon, no sound but wind and water, the endless conversation between sky and sea that has continued for millennia, witnessed by few and remembered by fewer still. The coastline you might imagine, were you to turn your gaze toward it, is sparse and weathered. Western Australia's Shark Bay region, with its small settlements and vast stretches of empty beach, where people lived their ordinary lives in the spring of 1941, unaware that the ocean they could see from their homes harboured dangers that official channels had kept largely hidden. The Indian Ocean itself was a highway of commerce and conquest during those years. Merchant vessels from a dozen nations moved along its expanse, carrying goods, carrying troops, carrying the complicated machinery of a world at war. But there were also hunters on those waters, ships that did not advertise their true purpose, ships that wore false colours and false names, that looked ordinary and harmless until the moment they revealed what lay beneath. This is a documentary about two of those ships, about the moment they found each other in the vastness of that ocean, and about the mystery that followed them both down into the deep. The mystery of what happened when they collided with each other, when they tore each other apart in a violent exchange that lasted mere minutes, but changed the course of a nation's understanding of war. A mystery that would not be solved for more than 60 years. If you'd like to fall asleep to more slow, deeply researched accounts of World War II naval history, told at a pace that honors both the accuracy of what happened and the quiet dignity of those lost, where mysteries are unraveled gently, not rushed, I'd invite you to subscribe to this series. Each episode unfolds the hidden stories of the ocean during wartime, the ships and crews that vanished, and the decades-long search to understand what really occurred in the darkness. And so we return to that ocean, to that evening light, to the moment before everything changes. The ship you must imagine first is called HMAS Sydney. She is a light cruiser of the Royal Australian Navy, built in the 1930s with pride and care, a vessel that had already seen war in the Mediterranean, that had proven her worth in battles far from home. She is returning now to Australian waters, to patrol the coasts that had suddenly become more dangerous, more exposed. She is sleek and purposeful, built for speed and for combat, crewed by men who knew their trade and took their duties seriously. 645 souls aboard, give or take. Young men, many of them, far from their families, doing what they had been asked to do. The other ship is harder to see at first, because seeing her is precisely what she was designed to prevent. She is called the Kormoran, and she was once a German merchant raider, a vessel that had been transformed from an ordinary cargo ship into something far more sinister. She wears a disguise as carefully as an actor dons a costume. To any observer, she appears to be the Straat Malacca, a Dutch freighter, a ship of no particular military significance, the sort of vessel you might pass on the ocean without a second glance. But beneath her false name and false colours, beneath the careful arrangement of her superstructure and the way her crew had learned to move about her decks, lay something quite different. She carried weapons. She carried men trained in deception and combat. She was, in short, a predator wearing the skin of prey. These two ships, Sydney and Kormoran, did not know each other's names. They did not know each other's histories or the men who commanded them or the nations they served. They were, on this particular evening, simply two vessels in an ocean so vast that the odds of their ever meeting seemed almost impossibly small. And yet they were about to meet. They were about to find each other in that emptiness, and what would follow would be one of the most contested and mysterious naval engagements of the entire war in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The Indian Ocean at dusk seems to stretch forever. The horizon becomes indistinct, the line between water and sky blurring into a single, seamless expanse. The waves continue their endless rhythm. The wind carries the salt smell of deep ocean, that particular scent that means nothing human is near, that you are in a place where the rules of land no longer apply. In a few hours, it would be completely dark. The moon, if it rose, would rise late. The stars would emerge one by one, as they have for centuries, indifferent to the affairs of men and their ships. But for now, there is still light enough to see. There is still enough visibility for one ship to spot another on the horizon. There is still time, one might say, for different choices to be made, for different paths to diverge. But choice is a strange thing in war. It often arrives too late, or not at all, and men and ships find themselves carrying out their orders and their trajectories toward meetings that cannot be avoided. In the quiet of that Indian Ocean evening, two ships were moving toward their moment of collision. Neither crew could have imagined, as they went about their duties, what was about to unfold. They could not have known that they were moving toward history, toward a mystery that would outlast the war itself, toward a series of questions that would not be answered until long after most of them were gone. The ocean waited. The ocean, as always, knew what was coming. If you find yourself drawn to these kinds of mysteries, the ones that sit at the intersection of history, human courage, and the sea's indifference, then there is something here worth exploring further. The story of what happened between the Kormoran and the Sydney is far more than a single afternoon of violence frozen in time. It is a portrait of an entire era, a war that reached into the farthest corners of the world's oceans, touching lives in ways that the people living through it could scarcely have imagined. If you would like to hear more stories like this one, stories that are deeply researched and told at a pace that allows you to truly sit with them, to understand not just what happened but why it mattered, then subscribe now. We are building a library of World War II naval history, each account uncovering another thread in the great tapestry of the war at sea. Each episode is crafted to walk you through history as if you were there, present in the moment, understanding the decisions made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The Kormoran and Sydney story is, in many ways, an ideal entry point because it contains within it so many of the larger themes that shaped the naval war in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. It speaks to the innovations in disguise and deception that navies employed. It reveals how quickly certainty could collapse into chaos on the open water. And it shows us how a moment of contact between two ships, two crews, two nations locked in global conflict could ripple outward for generations, leaving questions that would only be answered many decades later by technology that neither side could have predicted. As you hear more of this particular tale unfold, you will begin to understand why this encounter between two vessels has never released its hold on the imagination of historians, families, and the people of two nations still connected by what was lost that day. The mystery is not one that will be fully resolved by the end, and perhaps that is part of what makes it so enduring. Some of history's most profound moments are not the ones with clean answers, but the ones that ask us to sit with uncertainty, to acknowledge what we know and what remains obscured, to honor those who were there without presuming to fully understand what was in their minds in those final moments. That balance between knowing and not knowing, between the historical record and the human experience, is what we are reaching toward in these narratives. The war at sea was immense in scope, touching thousands of vessels and hundreds of thousands of lives across oceans that stretch almost beyond comprehension. Yet at its heart were always individual decisions, individual acts of courage, individual losses. The story of the Kormoran and Sydney brings all of that into focus, concentrating an entire war's worth of themes and tragedies into one encounter off the coast of Western Australia. As you listen to what unfolds here, you will be tracing not just a naval engagement, but a search for truth that would span decades, a quest to understand what happened to a ship and her crew that seemed to vanish without explanation, leaving behind only questions and grief. The narrative we are about to enter is one that has been constructed from official records, from survivor testimony, from the technical investigation of wrecks, and from the careful work of historians who understood that to truly honor the lost, you must be willing to examine the evidence slowly and thoroughly, without rushing to conclusions. This is the kind of history that reveals itself not in dramatic declarations, but in accumulated detail, in the small facts that, when assembled, begin to form a picture of what occurred. And so we invite you to settle into this story, to let it unspool at the pace it deserves, to accompany us as we move through time and across ocean, toward a discovery that would, after more than 60 years, finally provide some answers to questions that had haunted a nation. To understand what would happen on that November afternoon, we must first step back and see the world as it appeared in 1941, when the waters surrounding Australia had become something neither peaceful nor fully at war, but caught in a tense, uncertain state between them. The continent itself, vast, sunburned, and still young as nations measure time, lay on the edge of a conflict that had consumed Europe for 2 years. Yet for many Australians, the war remained distant, something that happened elsewhere, in places with names that seemed to belong to other worlds. The Indian Ocean, though, was beginning to tell a different story. Picture the shape of Australia as it appeared on naval maps of that era. A sprawling landmass facing outward on all sides, with a spine of coastline stretching thousands of miles from the tropical north to the temperate south. The Indian Ocean to the west was less a known quantity than a vast, half-charted realm, deeper in places than the mind easily conceives, and far from the concentrations of Allied naval power that protected the eastern cities and the shipping lanes that bound Britain and Australia together. Perth, on the western coast, was almost another country. It took days to reach by train from the population centres to the east. Between the settled places lay emptiness, the red interior, the empty beaches, the long stretches of coast where a ship could disappear and no one nearby would notice for days. In 1941, the waters of the Indian Ocean had become a highway for something other than ordinary commerce. The great shipping lanes that ran from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, carrying oil and supplies towards Singapore and Australia, were now haunted by a particular kind of predator. The British and their allies had grown accustomed to thinking of submarines as the primary threat, those grey, unseen hunters that sank merchant vessels from below. But there was another danger, older in some ways, that prowled these waters with deliberate patience: the disguised raider. These were ships that seemed to be something they were not. A German merchant raider looked, when you first glimpsed it from a distance, like any of 1,000 neutral vessels crossing the oceans. A freighter, painted in dull greys or rusts, bearing the markings of a Dutch company or a Swedish firm, flying flags that suggested it was merely trying to conduct its ordinary business and be left alone. Only if you came very close, only if you boarded her, only if she revealed herself, would you discover the guns hidden beneath innocent-looking panels, the ammunition stored in secret magazines, the crew trained in naval warfare. They were wolves dressed in the clothing of sheep, and the oceans of the world were their hunting ground. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, had developed this tactic with particular effectiveness in the years before and during the war. They took old merchant ships, refitted them with naval guns, gave them crews drawn from regular naval ranks, and sent them out to prey upon Allied shipping far from the centers of power where the main fleets operated. These were not kamikaze weapons or desperation measures. They were calculated long-range commerce raiders, designed to disrupt supply lines, tie down Allied naval resources in pursuit, and inflict damage that seemed to come from nowhere. A merchant captain, seeing an innocuous freighter on the horizon, might approach it without suspicion. By the time he realized his mistake, it was often far too late. In the Indian Ocean specifically, this threat had taken on a particular urgency by 1941. The waters between East Africa and Australia were becoming crowded with shipping. Not the vast convoys that the Atlantic sustained, but steady, vital traffic carrying materials of war toward the theatres where Japan was beginning to make its intentions felt. Australia's own navy was stretched thin, trying to defend a coastline of continental proportions with a small force of warships. The Indian Ocean, in those months, represented a kind of frontier, distant enough from the main theatres of conflict that some believed it remained relatively safe, yet positioned in a way that made it vulnerable to exactly the sort of raider that the Germans had learned to deploy. The intelligence services, of course, knew that these ships existed. Reports came in from neutral countries, from captured vessels, from wireless intercepts. There were whispers and rumors about a particular German raider that had been loose in the Indian Ocean, a ship that had been hunting for months, that had sunk vessels without any immediate explanation of what had attacked them. The Admiralty knew of her. The Australian Navy had received warnings. But warnings and certainties are not the same thing, and in a vast ocean where millions of tons of shipping moved every week, knowing that a danger might exist somewhere is very different from knowing where it is or being able to do anything about it. The coastline of Western Australia in particular held a kind of vulnerability. There were no great naval bases there, no concentration of warships, no radar stations watching the horizon with electronic eyes. Such things barely existed yet, and certainly not in Western Australia. The port of Fremantle existed, and Perth beyond it, but they were ports of a relatively minor significance in the strategic thinking of the day. The Indian Ocean, stretching west from the coast, seemed to many minds to be nobody's responsibility, a gap in the net through which smaller ships could move with relative freedom. And yet it was precisely this quality, this remoteness, this assumption of safety, that made it attractive to those who wished to strike without warning. Somewhere out there, in those waters that seemed so empty and so vast, a particular ship was hunting. She was German, though she did not appear to be. She was a warship, though nothing in her visible form suggested it. She had been at sea for many months, and her crew had grown accustomed to the routines of deception, the maintenance of false flags, the preservation of the disguise, the waiting. They were following patterns and information that suggested that if they continued along certain routes, they might encounter prey that was significant enough to justify their presence, their fuel consumption, their hunger for combat. What neither the German raiders nor the Australian Navy fully understood in that moment before the event was precisely how close the two ships already were to one another. The Indian Ocean, for all its vast size, was about to become very small indeed. Before Kormoran ever cast her nets across those dark waters, there was another vessel already moving through them with purpose and pride. HMAS Sydney was built in the early years of the 1930s, a time when the British Commonwealth was watching the gathering clouds over Europe with a mixture of hope and dread, and Australia, far from the old continent's troubles, was beginning to imagine what her own naval strength might mean. The Sydney, named for the nation's oldest and most prestigious port city, was constructed at the Cockatoo Island dockyard in Sydney Harbour itself, and for Australians of that era, there was something almost ceremonial about building such a ship in their own waters, as though the act of construction itself was a promise to the world of their independence and their readiness. She was a light cruiser, sleek and modern for her time, displacing about 6,000 tons when fully laden, with a hull painted in that distinctive pale grey that seemed to catch the light in ways that made her appear almost ghostly against darker seas. Her design was British, naturally enough, since Australia was still very much woven into the fabric of Commonwealth naval tradition, yet she represented something distinctly Australian too, a ship that belonged to this vast island nation, and over whom Australians felt a particular ownership that comes from having built something with their own hands in their own harbour. She carried 8 6-inch guns as her main armament, arranged in a way that gave her considerable firepower for her size, and she was fast enough to chase down merchant vessels or outrun heavier warships should the need arise. That balance between aggression and grace, between power and speed, made her particularly suited to the kind of commerce raiding and patrol work that would become so crucial in the waters around Australia once war truly came. When she was commissioned into the Royal Australian Navy in 1935, the ceremony itself carried weight. She became a symbol not just of military capability, but of Australia's own growing confidence as a nation. The Depression had ravaged the country only years before, and yet here was this magnificent warship, modern and powerful, bearing the name of Australia's greatest city. Officers and sailors who served aboard her in those early years spoke of a ship that moved well, that responded to her helm with a kind of eagerness, and there was within her crew a quiet pride that perhaps only those who serve in a nation's first truly modern warship can understand. When war came to Europe in 1939, Sydney was already building a reputation, and it was not long before her captain and her crew understood that this vessel, no matter how much she belonged to Australian waters, would be called upon to serve wherever the Navy's needs were greatest. She was dispatched to the Mediterranean in 1940, and it was there, in those ancient waters where so much naval history had already been written, that HMAS Sydney began to write her own legend. Off the coast of North Africa, in the waters between Africa and Europe, she encountered the Italian warship Bartolomeo Colleoni, a light cruiser not unlike herself, and in a brief, fierce engagement, Sydney's gunners proved their worth. The Colleoni was sunk, and word spread through the Australian Navy and Australian newspapers back home that this ship, their ship, had drawn first blood against a European power. It was a moment of genuine pride in a nation still learning what it meant to have a navy that could stand alongside the greatest maritime powers of Europe. But the Sydney's time in the Mediterranean, though marked by this victory and by the respect of her sister ships and her allies, was also a place of constant danger. The Italian navy was aggressive, the Luftwaffe prowled overhead, and U-boats hunted in the depths. Every patrol was a lesson in vigilance, and Sydney's officers and men learned what it meant to be constantly ready, to keep the ship at a state of readiness that demanded everything from them. They learned the weight of command at sea in wartime. They learned the exhaustion of watching horizons that might suddenly erupt with enemy fire. And perhaps most importantly, they learned the rhythm of naval warfare, the patient waiting, the sudden violence, the coordination and discipline required to keep a ship of war operating at her peak when lives depended on it. It was not until late in 1940 and continuing into 1941 that Sydney was eventually recalled to Australian waters. The Pacific situation was deteriorating, and Japan's ambitions were becoming clearer month by month. Australia needed her modern warships closer to home, patrolling those vast stretches of ocean that connected the continent to the rest of the world. The voyage back took Sydney through the Indian Ocean, and when she finally arrived back in Australian ports, there was a sense among her crew and among the Australian public that this ship was now a guardian, a a protector of the home nation itself. She had proven herself against a European enemy, and now she would stand watch over Australia's own coastlines and the shipping lanes that fed her commerce and sustained her position in the world. By the middle of 1941, HMAS Sydney had settled into a routine of patrols along the western coast of Australia, moving through waters that were, to her crew, both familiar and still somehow foreign. The Indian Ocean stretches for thousands of miles off Western Australia's coast, relatively empty, relatively peaceful in appearance, though by 1941 any Australian naval officer knew that peace in those waters could not be taken for granted. German raiders were known to be active in distant oceans, and merchant ships had been vanishing from sea lanes for months without explanation. The Sydney's purpose in these waters was to reassure, to patrol, to be ready, and to demonstrate that Australia had a naval presence in her own backyard that could not be ignored. She had become, in the minds of many Australians, a symbol of confidence, proof that even in this distant corner of the world, far from the great theatres of war, Australia could maintain a ship that was modern, capable, and ready to defend her interests. Her captain in November of 1941 was Joseph Burnett, an officer who had learned his trade in peacetime and in the harsh school of Mediterranean warfare. He was experienced, careful, and proud of his ship and his crew. The men under his command knew their duties, had drilled relentlessly, and trusted one another in the way that comes only from months of working together at sea. This was a ship that had already tasted victory, that had proven itself in combat, and that carried within it the accumulated confidence of all those experiences. She was, in many ways, exactly what Australia needed on those distant waters, visible, capable, and reassuring. Yet on the morning of November 19, 1941, as Sydney steamed westward through ordinary seas, not a soul aboard her could have known that this would be the last full day her crew would see together, or that by evening they would be meeting something that no amount of drills or confidence could have fully prepared them for. The ship that had survived the dangers of the Mediterranean, that had proven herself against a European enemy, was about to sail directly into a confrontation that would change everything for her crew, for Australia, and for the history of naval warfare itself. The vessel that would become the Kormoran began her existence in a German shipyard in the years before the war. Built originally as a modest merchant freighter destined for peaceful commerce across the world's trade routes, she was unremarkable in every way, a working ship, utilitarian, designed to carry cargo and make her owners modest profits in an era when such things still seemed possible without the weight of conflict bearing down upon everything. But as the 1930s drew toward their close, and Hitler's ambitions grew bolder with each year, Germany's naval planners found themselves facing a peculiar strategic problem. The British blockade would strangle German trade, they knew, and direct naval confrontation with the Royal Navy was impossible for a nation rebuilding its fleet from the ruins of the First World War. And so, from this necessity, was born an old idea dressed in new urgency: the raider, the disguised warship, the wolf in merchant's clothing that could prowl the world's oceans and prey upon the shipping lanes that sustained the British Empire. The Kormoran was selected for this role, and her transformation began quietly in German ports. What had been a simple freighter was methodically reconstructed into something far more dangerous. Hidden beneath innocent-looking cargo hatches, heavy guns were mounted, 6-inch pieces that could pierce the hull of a merchant vessel with terrible efficiency. Torpedo tubes were concealed within her hull. Her crew was quietly augmented with naval personnel, men trained in gunnery and naval warfare who wore merchant sailors' clothing and learned to move through her corridors as if they were dock workers rather than warriors. The transformation was thorough, almost intimate, every part of her redesigned to deceive, to hide her true nature beneath layers of ordinary appearance. But the Kormoran needed more than hidden guns to survive in the dangerous world of commerce raiding. She needed a new identity, a false face that would not immediately draw suspicion when she appeared on the horizon. And so she was given the name and the documents of a Dutch freighter, the Straat Malacca, supposedly a neutral merchant vessel registered in the Netherlands and engaged in innocent trade. Dutch flags could be raised when convenient. Dutch identity papers were carefully forged. Everything about her surface appearance was meticulously crafted to suggest she was exactly what she claimed to be, a working cargo ship, running supplies, posing no threat to anyone. The elaborate deception was so thorough that she might pass within sight of naval vessels and escape notice, or if she were approached, the initial moments of contact could be spent buying time while her crew rushed to their battle stations, while guns were uncovered and readied for the violence that might come. What must it have been like, one wonders, to serve aboard such a vessel in those wartime years? The crews of the German raiders were carefully selected, men who could endure the psychological strain of living a constant lie, who could sit on the bridge of a ship bristling with concealed weaponry and play the role of a peaceful merchant sailor, knowing that at any moment the disguise might be penetrated and they would be required to fight for their lives. They were isolated in a way that most naval personnel were not, cut off from the regular structures of fleet life, operating far from home ports or support, relying entirely upon their own ingenuity and the discipline of their crew to survive. Many of them were reserve officers or merchant marine personnel who had been conscripted into naval service, men who knew how to handle a ship, but who were now asked to become something part captain of commerce, part guerrilla warrior, part performer in an elaborate charade. The crew of the Kormoran in late 1941 consisted of some 290 men, though the exact number varied as sailors rotated through duties or were transferred to other vessels. These were ordinary German seamen and naval personnel, some of them career sailors, others conscripted into wartime service, all of them bound together by the peculiar intimacy and tension that comes from living in constant deception. They knew their ship's true nature, of course. They had watched her transformation in the shipyards. They had practiced their gunnery drills in secret. They had studied their target, merchant vessels of the Allies and neutrals who traded with the Allies, and understood what their mission entailed. Some of them, no doubt, harbored doubts about the morality of what they were being asked to do. Others may have felt a certain grim pride in being part of an elite force, a small group of men engaged in dangerous work, far from the rigid hierarchy and routine of conventional naval service. The burden of secrecy, though, must have weighed heavily on all of them. The Kormoran herself, despite her hidden weapons and dangerous mission, was no swift raider. She was slow, ponderous, a working ship converted to naval purposes, but retaining the modest speed of her original design. She could manage perhaps 14 or 15 knots in favorable conditions, which meant she could not chase down a fast merchant vessel, and could certainly not outrun a warship if discovered and pursued. Her survival depended entirely upon her disguise holding, upon encountering only merchant ships that were slower or less alert than herself, upon the enemy not suspecting her true nature until it was too late. This vulnerability, this dependence upon deception and the element of surprise, created a particular kind of tension in the daily life of her crew. They were powerful only so long as they remained hidden. The moment of revelation would transform them from hunters into hunted. In the months preceding her encounter with the Sydney, the Kormoran had been ranging across the Indian Ocean under the command of Captain Theodore Detmers, a career naval officer and experienced raider captain who had served in the earlier commerce raiding cruiser Emden and understood the peculiar demands of this dangerous form of warfare. Detmers was a meticulous commander, a man who understood that success depended upon discipline, upon maintaining the fiction of the Straat Malacca's identity no matter what pressures mounted, upon training his crew to respond instantly and precisely when the order came to unmask and attack. The Kormoran had sunk several vessels in the preceding months, always in the same pattern, approaching under false colours, demanding the target's surrender, and opening fire if the target attempted to escape or fight back. The crews of these vessels had been taken aboard when possible, imprisoned in the Cormoran's holds or on deck, representing an additional burden and constraint upon the ship's operations. Where could they be landed? How could they be kept secure? The presence of prisoners aboard a supposed neutral merchant vessel added another layer of complication to an already complex deception. Imagine the quiet, methodical existence aboard such a vessel in those months of 1941. Dawn would come across the Indian Ocean with the same slow beauty it brought to any maritime space, the sky gradually shifting from grey to gold as the sun rose above the horizon. The crew would go about their duties in the traditional rhythms of shipboard life: watch changes, maintenance of the engines and rigging, the preparation of meals in cramped galleys, the endless small tasks that keep a ship in working order. But beneath this apparent normalcy lay the constant knowledge of danger, the rehearsed readiness to transform from merchant sailor to naval combatant in the span of minutes. The guns were always there, hidden but present, a weight carried in the collective consciousness of the men who served aboard her. Conversations were careful, voices lowered in understanding that all must maintain the fiction should any stranger come aboard. Even in the privacy of the crew's quarters, the role had to be maintained, for security is often compromised by the smallest breaches of discipline, the careless word spoken to the wrong person, the moment of forgetfulness that undermines months of elaborate preparation. The Kormoran, then, in the autumn of 1941, was not simply a ship with hidden weapons and a false name. She was a floating performance, a carefully maintained illusion, a vessel whose very existence depended upon the absolute discipline and secrecy of everyone aboard her. She was a product of the desperate imagination of German naval planners facing overwhelming odds, converted from commerce into something approaching predation, staffed by men who understood that discovery meant either death or capture, who lived within a strange psychological space between the ordinary routines of merchant sailing and the extraordinary demands of naval warfare conducted in deception. And she was, in the opinion of her captain and crew, a successful predator. Several merchant vessels already lay at the bottom of the Indian Ocean thanks to the Cormoran's guns, their crews taken prisoner or left to fend for themselves in lifeboats. She had survived and thrived in those months of operation, her disguise holding firm, her crew maintaining discipline and readiness. No one yet knew that her days were drawing to a close, that within weeks her entire existence would be reversed, that the hunted would become the hunter hunted, that the elaborate deception that had protected her would be stripped away in a moment of terrible violence off the coast of Western Australia. The transformation of an ordinary merchant vessel into a weapon of war was a peculiar kind of alchemy, one that played on the fundamental uncertainty of the ocean itself. In the vastness of international waters, a ship was often nothing more than the flag it flew and the hull markings its crew chose to display. And in the early years of the Second World War, Germany discovered that this vulnerability could be turned into a subtle, devastating advantage. These were the commerce raiders, or Handelskrieg vessels, as the German Navy called them, a small fleet of converted cargo ships that prowled the world's shipping lanes like wolves dressed in sheep's clothing. They represented a different philosophy of naval warfare than the great battleship engagements that captured the public imagination. There would be no dramatic confrontations between armored giants in the North Atlantic. Instead, these raiders operated with a kind of patient invisibility, their purpose hidden beneath layers of deception that could only be penetrated at the moment of attack itself. The concept was not new. Germany had used such vessels in the First World War, and the strategy had proved both psychologically and economically effective. A single raider, harmless-looking and unimposing, could force entire convoys into altered routes, could tie up naval resources across vast distances, and could inspire a pervading anxiety among merchant crews who never knew what they might encounter on the horizon. But by the Second World War, the technology and sophistication of these conversions had evolved considerably. These were no longer improvised vessels, hastily armed with whatever cannons could be bolted to their decks. The transformation began in the yards of German shipyards, or, more often, in the quiet recesses of occupied ports, where skilled engineers and naval architects worked in secrecy. A merchant ship selected for conversion would be stripped down with meticulous care. The cargo holds, those vast empty spaces designed to carry innocent commercial goods, would be reimagined as weapon storage, ammunition magazines, and fuel reserves. The hull itself would be subtly reinforced, not so much that it would noticeably change how the vessel sat in the water, but enough to withstand the recoil and stress of combat. Armor plating would be fitted in critical areas, hidden beneath the ordinary wooden superstructure and painted steel that made a cargo ship look like a cargo ship. The weaponry was the most fascinating part of this transformation. 6-inch guns, capable of devastating any merchant vessel in seconds, would be mounted on hidden rotatable mounts that could be swiftly raised into firing position once the disguise was no longer needed. Anti-aircraft guns were similarly concealed. Torpedo tubes were fitted into specially constructed compartments. Everything was designed to remain invisible until the moment it was needed, to transform in seconds from a picture of commercial innocence into a bristling warship. The effect was rather like discovering that a seemingly ordinary person had been concealing extraordinary power all along. The outer appearance, the camouflage that made these vessels so effective, was maintained with obsessive attention to detail. False funnels were constructed or repositioned to alter the ship's silhouette. Superstructure was added or modified. Most crucially, the vessels were painted to match the appearance of merchant ships belonging to various neutral nations. Dutch freighters were particularly favored as cover, along with Swedish and Norwegian designs. The names on the hull could be changed in a single night. Sets of flags from different nations were carefully stowed, ready to be hoisted according to circumstances. Even the crew's appearance was controlled. Uniforms were concealed, and the raiders' men would dress as ordinary merchant sailors, moving slowly about the deck in the deliberate, unhurried way of a cargo crew, rather than with the briskness of military personnel. What made these vessels truly distinctive, however, was the peculiar culture that developed within them. The crews of the commerce raiders were volunteers, and they had to be. The life aboard such a ship required a particular kind of temperament, long periods of anonymity and solitude interspersed with moments of sudden, violent action. The men had to be prepared to maintain the fiction of ordinariness while living under conditions of constant readiness. Every person aboard had to know exactly what to do when the moment came to drop the disguise and transform the ship from merchant vessel to warship. Drills were conducted, procedures were memorized, and a shared understanding developed among officers and men that they were participating in something unique and dangerous. The hunting strategy itself was shaped by the very nature of these vessels. They could not seek out heavily defended convoys or military targets. They were not fast enough to catch modern destroyers, nor were they strong enough to withstand concentrated naval fire. Instead, they moved through the sea like hunters seeking prey, using radio intelligence when available, watching the horizon for the telltale smoke of a merchant vessel's funnels, waiting for the moment when an unsuspecting freighter might wander into their path. They were solitary predators, operating in vast oceanic territories, sometimes traveling for weeks without encountering another vessel. The psychological impact of these raiders on Allied shipping was disproportionate to their actual numbers. How many were there really? Perhaps a dozen or so, scattered across the world's oceans, and yet their existence created an atmosphere of pervasive uncertainty. A merchant captain scanning the horizon might wonder whether a distant ship flying a friendly flag was what it claimed to be. Radio silence became the rule rather than the exception, as vessels tried to avoid revealing their positions to potential raiders. Insurance rates climbed, shipping routes were altered and rerouted. Resources that might have been used elsewhere were devoted to searching for these invisible threats. And they remained largely invisible, operating with a kind of ghostly efficiency. Some of the earlier raiders had remarkable records. The Atlantis, for instance, ranged across multiple oceans and captured or sank dozens of vessels before finally being discovered and destroyed. Others had briefer operational lives, but each one, no matter how short its career, contributed to a climate of wariness and vigilance on the seas. They represented a form of naval warfare that required no great battles, no dramatic confrontations, no heroic gestures. Just patience, deception, and the willingness to strike when the moment was right. This was the world into which the Kormoran fit perfectly. She was, in many ways, an exemplar of her type, well-designed, well-disguised, well-crewed, and well-suited to her role as a hidden predator of merchant shipping. And like so many of her sister vessels, she carried within her transformation the seeds of a singular, unforgettable encounter. For on a particular November afternoon in 1941, the Kormoran's deception would meet not another merchant vessel, but a warship that was very much what it claimed to be. And in that meeting, the whole philosophy of the disguised raider would be tested in the fires of actual combat. The afternoon of November 19th wore on quietly across the Indian Ocean, the kind of day where the sky and water seemed to dissolve into each other at the horizon, neither quite distinguishable from the other. The light was beginning to shift toward that golden hour when the sun hangs lower and softer, and the sea takes on a peculiar stillness that sailors know often precedes change. HMAS Sydney was conducting her routine patrol off Shark Bay on the Western Australian coast, a stretch of ocean that had become familiar to her crew through months of watchful steaming. The war felt distant then, even as the threat of it hung somewhere in the vastness beyond. The men aboard Sydney were neither relaxed nor anxious. Vigilance had become their rhythm, the steady pulse of a warship moving through waters that might hold danger or might hold nothing at all. Lookouts stood at their posts, eyes trained on the horizon, watching the horizon in that particular way that sailors do, not quite seeing, but always ready to see. The ship moved with purpose and grace, her hull cutting through the water with the confidence of a vessel that had proven herself in battle and come home victorious. There was pride in her movements, a kind of assured gliding that spoke of crew confidence and well-maintained machinery. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, one of the lookouts spotted something on the horizon. It was distant at first, just a smudge against the sky, the kind of thing that might be a ship, or might be a cloud, or might be nothing at all. But as the minutes passed, and Sydney steamed forward on her course, the smudge took shape. A vessel, flying no flag that could be clearly seen from this distance. A merchant ship, it appeared, moving slowly through the water, seemingly alone in that vast and empty ocean. The sighting was reported up the chain of command. Captain Joseph Burnett, who commanded Sydney, received the information with the quiet professionalism of a man who had seen merchant vessels before and would see many more. And yet even routine sightings carried weight in wartime. A ship with no clear colours, moving alone in remote waters, was worth approaching, worth identifying, worth understanding. There was no alarm in the decision to change course and move closer. There was merely procedure, the logical actions of a naval commander doing what naval commanders do when they encounter the unknown. The approach was not hurried. There would have been no reason to rush. Both ships were moving across the same stretch of water, separated by distance that closed gradually as the afternoon lengthened. Sydney altered her course to intercept, a maneuver performed countless times before, routine as breathing. The unidentified vessel continued on her course, seemingly indifferent to or unaware of the warship now orienting itself toward contact. From the bridge of Sydney, officers would have been watching, noting details, trying to read the smaller ship like a language they half understood. As the distance closed, features began to emerge from the blur of distance. The vessel was a freighter, that much became clear. Medium-sized, the kind of working merchant ship that carried cargo and supplies through the world's oceans. Her hull was dark, showing signs of the patina that comes from months at sea. Her superstructure rose behind the cargo holds in that utilitarian way that merchant ships carry, all function and no pretense. But what flag did she fly? The question would have been asked repeatedly as the ships drew closer, as officers strained to identify the colours that might or might not be visible from Sydney's bridge. The time was perhaps 4 o'clock, or perhaps closer to 5. The afternoon was deepening now, the sun noticeably lower, the quality of light becoming more amber, more theatrical. The two ships moved across the water toward their meeting point, each following their own path of momentum and intention, neither knowing what the other truly was. To the crew of Sydney, this was simply another identification, another opportunity to verify that the ocean remained under some measure of control, that the shipping lanes still belonged to those who patrolled them. To the crew of the ship ahead, whatever awareness they had of Sydney's approach, the feeling would have been more complex, more layered with tension. Do you ever wonder what the last moments of ordinary routine feel like when they are happening? When people are simply going about their work, checking instruments, maintaining the ship, performing tasks they have performed 100 times before, entirely unaware that the nature of their reality is about to change forever. The crews of both ships existed in that moment together, in a kind of shared breathing space, moving towards something that none of them could yet see clearly, though the invisible shape of it was already drawing them together. The gap between the two vessels continued to narrow. Sydney's speed and course were steady, purposeful. She was not approaching with any sense of violence or urgency, merely with the patient determination of a naval vessel following standard procedure. The crew would have been alert, yes, but alert in the way that sailors are alert during ordinary work. Lookouts at their posts, officers on the bridge, the machinery of the ship humming with the familiar vibrations of diesel and steel and human purpose. And somewhere ahead, growing larger with each passing minute, lay a ship that was not quite what she appeared to be, that wore her disguise like skin, that carried a crew with entirely different intentions. By late afternoon, the ships would have been close enough for voices to carry across the water, close enough for details to become unmistakable. The identity of the merchant vessel was still a question, still unresolved, still the subject of careful observation and growing curiosity. But the approach itself was unhurried, the kind of slow convergence that allows time for the mind to work, for possibilities to be considered, for the ordinary procedures of naval identification to unfold as they had unfolded 1,000 times before in 1,000 other moments. What neither ship knew, what no one aboard either vessel could have possibly sensed in those golden late afternoon hours, was that they were moving toward the moment when everything would transform. The calm waters, the golden light, the routine procedures, the crews going about their work. All of it was about to be unmade by the collision of intent, by the sudden shedding of pretense, by the revelation of what lay hidden beneath carefully constructed illusion. But for now, in the fading light of November afternoon, the two ships simply continued their slow approach toward each other, unaware, inevitable, drawn together by the invisible currents of fate and war. The afternoon light had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, when the lookouts aboard Sydney first noticed the smoke. A thin column, grey and distant, rising from the vast and otherwise empty sea somewhere to the northwest. It was November 19th, 1941, and the waters off Shark Bay were calm that day, the sort of calm that can feel almost expectant, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. The Sydney's captain, Joseph Burnett, was a methodical man, experienced in the patterns of wartime vigilance, and when word came down from the crow's nest about an unidentified vessel, he ordered the ship altered course toward it without hesitation. This was routine, after all. Patrols meant investigating anything unusual, anything out of place. As the distance closed, the mystery only deepened. Through the binoculars of the Sydney's officers, a ship began to materialize from the shimmer of heat haze and distance. She appeared to be a freighter, a merchant vessel of moderate size, and there was nothing in her silhouette that immediately suggested danger. Her hull was painted in the colors one might expect of a Dutch or perhaps Belgian cargo ship. Neutral colors, merchant colors. She was flying a flag, though in those first moments, identifying which flag with absolute certainty would have been difficult. The sun was low and bright, throwing everything into partial silhouette, but there was something about her, perhaps in the way she sat in the water, or in the particular configuration of her masts and superstructure, that made the lookouts pause before declaring her identity with complete confidence. The captain made a decision that seemed entirely appropriate under the circumstances. He ordered the Sydney to approach the vessel more closely, to move within hailing distance so that signals could be exchanged, so that her registry could be confirmed and her intentions understood. There were protocols for this, formal and long-established procedures that governed the interaction between a warship and an unidentified merchant vessel in wartime. The Sydney would fly her own flags, make her position clear, and demand that the other vessel identify herself. It was what any competent naval officer would do. It was what the situation required. The afternoon deepened. The two ships drew nearer to one another across the water, and with each passing minute, the details became clearer and the questions more pressing. The merchant vessel, or what appeared to be one, showed no signs of alarm at the approach of a warship. There were no desperate maneuvers, no attempt to flee or to increase distance. She seemed almost passive, almost resigned. Did her crew expect this encounter? Did they have a story ready, a fabricated manifest, false papers carefully prepared for exactly this moment? Almost certainly yes. Because the ship that approached from the northwest was not what she appeared to be. She was the Kormoran, a German raider, and she had spent months cloaked in deception, moving through Allied shipping lanes under the borrowed identity of the Dutch freighter Straat Malacca. The Sydney's crew had no way of knowing this yet. There were no obvious signs of weaponry, no glimpse of the hidden gun mounts that could be swung into position within moments. The deck appeared clean and ordinary, the work of a merchant crew going about their business. But someone aboard the Kormoran, in those tense minutes as the warships drew closer, was watching the Sydney through optics of their own, watching and calculating, watching and preparing. The signals began. The Sydney, approaching now to within what seemed a safe distance, ran up her flags, demanding identification. The Kormoran responded, slowly, carefully, as if her captain were buying time, as if each moment were precious. She ran up the Dutch flag. She displayed what purported to be her name and registry. The signals flew back and forth between the two vessels, a dialogue conducted in the formal language of the sea, each message a small exchange of information that seemed to confirm normalcy, to suggest that this was nothing more than a routine encounter between a warship and a neutral merchant ship. But Captain Burnett of the Sydney was an experienced officer, and something in the responses he received seemed not quite right. There was hesitation in the Kormoran's signals. There was a quality of delay, as if her crew were consulting with one another, as if someone on her bridge were making decisions that required consultation. The ship's movements were odd as well. She seemed to be maneuvering slightly, shifting her position in ways that were subtle but observable, as if she were trying to position herself at some particular angle relative to the Sydney. Or perhaps this is something we read into history now, with the knowledge of what was about to happen, a pattern finding that makes sense only after the fact. What is known for certain is that Burnett became increasingly uncertain. The responses to his signals were evasive enough, vague enough, that he began to suspect deception. He had been given warnings, in the weeks and months before this afternoon, about the German raiders that had been reported in the Indian Ocean, ships that were not what they appeared, ships that had sunk Allied vessels without warning. He knew the danger was real. He knew it was possible. And as the afternoon light continued its descent, as the distance between the two ships continued to narrow, he made another decision. He would approach even closer. He would get close enough that if this were indeed the mysterious raider that intelligence reports had suggested was operating in these waters, he would be in a position to demand her surrender, to show her the power of a warship in close proximity. It was a reasonable calculation. It was also the moment at which Captain Burnett began to sail unknowingly toward the greatest naval tragedy in Australian history. The afternoon light was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon when the wireless operators aboard Sydney received the response they had been waiting for. The vessel identified itself as the Straat Malacca, a Dutch merchant ship, carrying general cargo on a routine voyage through waters that had grown increasingly dangerous. Everything about the identification seemed to fit. The papers were in order, or at least appeared to be when reviewed at a distance. Captain Burnett of Sydney, a seasoned naval officer with decades of service behind him, found himself weighing the possibilities with the careful logic of a man trained in wartime vigilance, yet also constrained by the protocols of his position. A merchant vessel flying neutral colours, or claiming to do so, could not be fired upon without proper justification. The rules of engagement, even in these darkened times, required a certain formality, a certain restraint. But something in the exchange had begun to trouble the men aboard the cruiser. Perhaps it was a delay in the response, or an irregularity in the signal itself, or simply the accumulated instinct of officers who had lived long enough in this war to sense when appearances did not align with reality. Sydney's captain made the decision to close the distance further, to approach within a range where visual inspection would become possible, where doubts might be resolved by the simple act of observation. It was a decision born of protocol, of proper procedure. It was also, though he could not have known it then, a decision that would seal the fate of every man beneath the steel of his ship. As the Australian cruiser drew nearer, her guns still elevated at angles of greeting rather than combat, the crew of the Kormoran watched through their sighting equipment. They had been expecting this moment, or something like it, since they had assumed their false identity weeks before. The tension aboard the German raider had been mounting steadily as the hours passed. The men knew that their disguise, however well maintained, could only withstand scrutiny from a distance. They understood, with the clarity that comes from weeks of training and the weight of their secret, that the moment of discovery would come suddenly, without warning, and that when it arrived, they would need to act with perfect coordination and absolute speed. The commanding officer of the Kormoran, Captain Theodore Detmers, was a man who had contemplated this moment repeatedly. He had studied the silhouettes of Allied warships, understood the capabilities of their guns, and calculated with grim precision what the odds would be if fortune did not favour the raider in those first, critical seconds. He knew that surprise was his only genuine advantage. He knew that hesitation would be fatal, and as Sydney continued her approach, drawing closer with each passing minute, the moment when hesitation would need to transform into action was arriving with inexorable certainty. There are accounts, drawn from the German survivors who were rescued in the days following the battle, that describe the tension among the Kormoran's crew as the distance between the two ships closed to what naval officers call point-blank range. Men stood at their battle stations, alert and prepared, yet technically still concealed beneath the false facade of a peaceful merchant vessel. The guns were loaded and aimed, the crews were ready, but the flag still flew, the false superstructure still stood, and the deception still held. When the moment came, it came almost as a relief, not from the standpoint of those who were about to lose their lives, but from the perspective of those who could no longer bear the tension of pretense. The Cormoran's commanding officer issued the order, and the ship's true identity was revealed as abruptly as tearing away a curtain in a darkened room. The false plating that had hidden the gun emplacements was dropped or blown away. The merchant ship's profile suddenly transformed into the lean, predatory shape of a military vessel, and in the space of seconds that seemed to compress both time and meaning, the guns of the Kormoran opened fire at a range so close that missing would have required a fundamental failure of gunnery. Sydney's men, caught in that instant between suspicion and verification, between alertness and actual combat, had only the briefest moment to comprehend what was occurring. The transformation from a routine approach to a merchant vessel into active combat was almost incomprehensible in its speed. Officers who had been calmly assessing the situation suddenly found themselves in the midst of violence. Crew members who had been standing at ease or going about their duties were thrown into the desperate, chaotic movements of battle stations. The shock of it, the sheer unexpected ferocity, was perhaps as significant as the physical damage itself in those opening moments. The guns of the Kormoran, positioned to rake across the Australian cruiser at almost touching distance, began to find their targets with terrible accuracy. The initial salvos struck the Sydney with a force that must have seemed overwhelming. These were not the opening probes of a distant naval engagement, where shells travelled great distances and left time for reaction and maneuver. This was point-blank fire, the kind that leaves no margin for error and no opportunity for the defending ship to respond with equal effectiveness from the same distance. The initial moments of the engagement were entirely one-sided, a brief window in which the Cormoran's surprise and preparation created a devastating advantage. Yet even as the shells struck home, even as the Australian cruiser's superstructure erupted in flame and smoke, the men aboard Sydney were responding. Perhaps it was instinct, perhaps it was training, perhaps it was something deeper and less rational than either of those things. The cruiser's guns, even in those first confused and terrible seconds, began to return fire. The crews, many of them untouched by the initial barrage, pulled themselves together and began to aim at the vessel that had moments before seemed to be a harmless merchant ship. The return fire, though initially less coordinated than the Cormoran's devastating opening, began to find their enemy as well. What had been, in those first few seconds, a lopsided engagement where one side held all the advantages, was transforming, even as the smoke rose and the noise continued, into a true battle, a confrontation between two armed vessels, both damaged, both fighting, both aware now that they were in a struggle where the outcome remained uncertain. The surprise had been complete, but it had also been brief. The question that now hung in the darkening air above the Indian Ocean was not whether the Cormoran's disguise had been effective, that had already been proven, but whether that initial advantage could be translated into victory, or whether the Sydney, despite the shock and the damage, might yet turn this engagement in a direction its opponent had not anticipated. What followed in those final moments of daylight was neither the clean engagement of disciplined naval gunners nor the chaos of untrained crews, but something between, a desperate, concentrated violence compressed into minutes that would reshape the lives of two nations. As Cormoran's guns erupted and her true colours rose in place of the neutral Dutch flag, Sydney's crew faced the terrible calculus of modern naval warfare. They were already close enough that escape was impossible, and their opponent had chosen the moment of contact with surgical precision. The German raider, despite her converted merchant origins, carried formidable armament. 6 150mm guns, concealed beneath canvas and false superstructure, now spoke in rapid succession across the darkening water. Sydney responded with her own 8 6-inch guns, crews moving with the muscle memory of their Mediterranean campaigns, where this ship had earned her reputation. But there was a crucial asymmetry in that moment. Kormoran had positioned herself at optimal range, had prepared her gunners in hiding, and had the advantage of surprise. Sydney, still identifying her opponent, was fighting reactively rather than from prepared strength. The water between them, perhaps 2,000 yards at the moment of unmasking, became a churning corridor of violence. Shells from both ships tore across that narrow space. German rounds found their marks with terrible consistency. One struck Sydney's bridge, another penetrated deeper into her hull. A third ruptured her fuel oil tanks. Within minutes, the proud light cruiser was wrapped in smoke and flame, her superstructure becoming a pyre against the dwindling light of late afternoon. The glow of her burning would be visible for miles across the Indian Ocean, a terrible beacon marking a ship in her final agony. Yet Sydney was fighting back with equal ferocity, and the Cormoran's crew soon discovered that even a cornered merchant ship turned raider could not withstand the concentrated fire of a trained naval gunner. German shells scattered across the water. Some found air, but others found their target. Hits on the Cormoran's hull, on her engine rooms, on the fragile converted structure that held her together. A warship built and designed for such punishment might have absorbed these blows. A merchant vessel, regardless of her guns, was inherently fragile. The Cormoran began to take on water. Her engines faltered. The smoke pouring from her funnels mixed now with the smoke of her own fires. Both ships, it became clear within those compressed seconds of engagement, were dying. This was not a contest that would end with one victor sailing away and one vanquished sinking. This was mutual destruction, as if the two vessels had been locked into a fateful embrace from the moment they first sighted each other through the haze. The irony of it, a German raider and a British Commonwealth cruiser, each now equally doomed, would only become apparent later as men struggled to survive what was unfolding. The light was failing faster now. The tropical dusk of the Indian Ocean moves with sudden finality, and as the sun approached the horizon, the flames from both burning ships became the dominant source of illumination. Crews aboard each vessel faced cascading crises, fires to contain or abandon, flooding that could not be stopped, systems destroyed, men wounded, the terrible knowledge settling in that their ship was already lost. For Sydney's men, there was perhaps still some hope that they might beach her or hold her afloat long enough for rescue. For Cormoran's crew, that hope had grown very thin indeed. The battle itself, measured in the exchange of shells and the tearing of metal, lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Not long in the accounting of human history, but those 20 minutes rewrote the fates of 645 men aboard Sydney and 297 aboard the German raider. In that brief, fierce window, the Indian Ocean's waters became a graveyard waiting to be filled. Both ships were now burning, both were crippled, both were beginning to sink. And as darkness approached across the water, the question was no longer who would win the battle, that had already been determined by the laws of physics and the terrible efficiency of naval gunfire, but who would survive what came next. The battle had ended, but the real tragedy was only beginning. In the fading light, as smoke and flame rose against the darkening sky, neither crew could have known what the night would bring, or how profoundly different their fates would be. The Indian Ocean, which had seemed so vast and empty that morning, had suddenly become very crowded with the dying and the desperate. And the sea, as it always does, was preparing to claim its due. And so, in those final moments as the sun touched the horizon and the Indian Ocean turned toward darkness, two ships, once real, once pretense, began their descent into history. The Kormoran's gunners had achieved what they came so far to accomplish. The Sydney, despite her greater firepower and her crew's desperate attempts to return fire, had sustained wounds too grave to survive. Her superstructure was ablaze, her communication systems shattered, her hull perforated below the waterline by shells and torpedoes that no one had expected her to face on an ordinary autumn afternoon in 1941. And in the gathering dusk, as smoke rolled across the water in towering columns, Captain Detmers of the Kormoran made a choice that would echo through decades. The German raider herself was crippled beyond repair. The Sydney's return fire, though confused and uncoordinated, had nonetheless found their mark repeatedly. The Kormoran was taking on water. Her engines were failing. There was no possibility of nursing her back to any port, no friendly harbour within reach. She would either sink where she floated or be sent down deliberately. Captain Detmers chose the latter. It was a captain's prerogative, perhaps even his duty, to spare his ship the indignity of a slow, uncontrolled death by the sea. The order came to scuttle her, to abandon her deliberately. The German crew, those who had survived the fierce exchange, prepared the lifeboats and rafts. They set explosive charges in the engine room and the forward compartments. They made certain that when she went down, she would go down completely, leaving nothing for the enemy to salvage or to study. It was a practical choice, born of wartime necessity, and it removed one layer of evidence from what was already becoming a mystery. The lifeboats pushed away from the Kormoran's side as darkness fell, and her crew, some 300 men, watched from the water as their ship, the vessel that had carried them across thousands of miles of ocean, slipped beneath the surface. The explosions muffled and strange in the gathering night, the final glimpses of her hull catching the last light before she was gone. It was a kind of ritual, this deliberate sending of a ship to the bottom, and those who witnessed it carried the weight of that moment forward into whatever came next. But it was the Sydney that haunted them, because as the Kormoran disappeared into the deep, the Sydney, burning, wounded, listing heavily, did not follow the same course. She did not drift nearby. She did not settle to the bottom in a place where her location might be estimated or her wreckage eventually found. Instead, she turned away from the Kormoran's survivors. She limped off into the gathering darkness, moving slowly eastward, her fires visible for some time on the horizon, before the curvature of the sea and the thickening night erased her from view entirely. What happened in those final hours aboard the Sydney remains, even now, filtered through speculation and physical evidence rather than testimony, because there would be no survivors from her, no officer to file a report, no crewman to speak to what occurred in her burning compartments as water poured through the breaches in her hull. The darkness that swallowed her was absolute. The most likely reconstruction, supported by the physical evidence that would not surface until many decades later, suggests a ship in her death throes. The Sydney was listing severely to port, her structure weakened by the violence she had endured. The fires that burned her superstructure and engulfed her bridge and smokestack were likely beyond the crew's ability to control. The water flooding her compartments was rising steadily. Below decks, men would have been struggling through narrow corridors illuminated by emergency lighting that was failing, trying to reach the upper decks or the spaces where lifeboats might be launched. The scenes would have been chaotic and terrible, though the details exist now only in the realm of inference. Did she sink that night, slowly settling as her fires burned themselves out and the sea claimed her compartment by compartment? Or did she remain afloat a while longer, drifting through the night, a floating wreck without power or direction, until some final catastrophe sent her down. The evidence would suggest the latter, but even the timing remains uncertain. Hours passed between the end of the battle and whatever moment the Sydney finally slipped beneath the surface. And crucially, when she did go down, she took with her every member of her crew, 645 men, officers and sailors, men who had trained together, served together across the Mediterranean, and returned to their homeland only to be lost in waters they had patrolled in confidence just weeks before. Every voice that might have explained what happened, every witness to her final moments, went down with the ship into the depths of the Indian Ocean. The Kormoran survivors floated in the lifeboats and on rafts, watching the lights of the Sydney disappear. Some of them may have assumed she would be found soon, that rescue ships from Perth or other Australian ports would locate her wreckage within hours, that the details of what happened out here would be documented and understood. They did not know, as they drifted through the night in the cold water, that they had participated in one of the ocean's great vanishing acts, that a ship of war, a symbol of a nation, would disappear so completely that for decades her fate would remain one of the Second World War's most baffling and painful mysteries. The lifeboats and rafts of the Kormoran drifted eastward on the currents, carrying the men who had just sent their own ship to the bottom and watched another slip away into darkness. They had water, some provisions, and the peculiar form of safety that comes from being the only witnesses to an act that no one else would see. They had the night sky above them and the vast Indian Ocean in all directions, and they had no idea that the absence of survivors from the Sydney would, in the years and decades to come, prompt 100 questions that they alone could partially answer, but whose answers would themselves become the subject of doubt and disagreement. What they possessed was not certainty. It was only their memories of what they had seen, filtered through the shock of survival, the trauma of battle, and the strange distortions that memory imposes on extreme events. They had seen the Sydney burning and listing. They had watched her move away into the darkness. They had seen no lifeboats launched. They had heard no distress signals, but they had not seen the moment of her sinking. That moment remained hers alone, witnessed by no one who would live to speak of it, preserved only in the wreckage itself, silent on the ocean floor, waiting. The Indian Ocean that night held two separate stories, unfolding in the darkness like chapters written in different languages. While HMAS Sydney slipped beneath the surface with no one to witness her descent, some 400 nautical miles away, the men of the Kormoran were clinging to wooden rafts and collapsible lifeboats, their vessel already settled on the seafloor below them, and the enormity of what had just happened beginning only now to settle into their consciousness. The German survivors had managed to launch their boats in the chaos and confusion of those final moments after they had scuttled their own ship. There was no time for ceremony, no orderly evacuation, only the desperate scramble to abandon a dying vessel before she pulled men down with her into the abyss. Some made it into the lifeboats, others clung to rafts. A few drifted on pieces of wreckage, their voices calling across the water in the darkness, their uniforms heavy and cold. The night was not kind. The Indian Ocean in November, even this far north, holds a chill that seeps into exhausted men, that makes the hours feel longer than they should, that turns survival itself into an endurance test, measured not in miles but in breaths. They were, these men, adrift without certainty. Some among them did not know whether Sydney had sunk. Some had seen her burning, yes, listing heavily to one side, smoke pouring from her hull into the darkening sky. But in the confusion of their own evacuation, in the roar of the fire and the sounds of their ship dying beneath them, what had happened to that Australian vessel in those final minutes remained unclear. Had she gone down? Would she return? Were their rescuers already on their way? The radio operators among them would have known that distress signals had been sent before the Kormoran lost her wireless capability, but whether Sydney herself had managed to radio for help, whether anyone had heard her, whether help was coming toward them or toward her, these questions hung in the cold air above the rafts like an unresolved melody. Dawn came eventually, as it always does, and with it came a strange, uncertain relief. The German survivors took stock of what they had. They had lifeboats and supplies sufficient, by the grace of meager preparation, to keep them alive for some days if they could maintain their floating apparatus and ration their water and food. They had no way of knowing that they had become, at that precise moment, among the only witnesses to an event that would occupy historians and searchers and grieving families for the next 70 years. In the days that followed, they drifted. Some accounts suggest they waited, hoping for rescue from passing vessels or from their own forces. Others indicate they attempted to sail toward the nearest land, though the Indian Ocean does not yield easily to men in small boats. The heat of the day gave way to the cold of the nights. Men grew thirsty, men grew afraid, and among them, certain questions began to crystallize in the mind of their captain and officers. Where was the Sydney? Had she sunk or had she limped away, damaged but afloat, to report what had happened? If she had reported, would the rescue that came be German or British or Australian? Would they be taken as prisoners of war, or would some other fate await them? It was not German ships that found them, nor was it the enemies they feared. It was the fishing vessel Automedon, a French ship sailing under what nominal authority remained to France in those dark years, that came upon their lifeboats on November 23rd, 4 days after the battle. The German survivors were rescued from the water, brought aboard, and gradually given access to food and water and the basic human kindnesses that even wartime could not entirely extinguish. They were, after all, men first, and soldiers second, and they had suffered. But here is where the historical record becomes peculiar, where the eyewitness testimony grows shadowed and incomplete. The German survivors, when they were eventually interrogated by Australian authorities, when their accounts were recorded in official documents and archived in the slow, methodical way that militaries preserve the testimonies of captured men, could tell the Australians about the battle itself. They could describe the conditions that led to it, the approach of Sydney across the water, the moment when the disguise was dropped and the guns emerged and the sky began to burn. They could describe the ferocity of the exchange, the growing list of their own vessel, the order to abandon ship. Yet when it came to the question that mattered most to the Australians, to the government, to the families who would soon begin their long vigil of waiting, what happened to HMAS Sydney, the German accounts grew uncertain. Some said they had seen her burning. Some said they believed she had gone down. Some said they could not be certain. None of them could describe Sydney's final moments, because none of them had witnessed them. What they had seen was their own ship, the Kormoran, their responsibility, their tragedy. Beyond the smoke and the darkness and the chaos of their own evacuation, the fate of their opponent remained obscured. There is something profoundly human in this uncertainty, something that captures a quality of war that is often overlooked. In the midst of battle, when men are fighting for their lives, their perception narrows to the immediate, the visible, the overwhelming present. The Kormoran men knew what they knew about their own vessel and their own survival. The rest was, necessarily, inference and assumption and memory filtered through trauma and fear. What made this particular gap in testimony so consequential, however, was that there were no other witnesses. Sydney had sent her distress signals, but whether she had provided coordinates or details, whether those signals had reached any station that could respond, remained a matter of official secrecy and bureaucratic confusion. She had fought and burned, and, as the German testimony suggested, likely sunk. But in the darkness and distance, at the edge of her sinking, whether she went down in minutes or hours, whether she drifted or descended quickly, whether any man had survived her going down and might yet be found clinging to wreckage. These questions were left entirely open. The German survivors were taken into custody, processed, eventually sent to prisoner of war camps in Australia itself, a strange geography where captors and captives shared the same vast landscape, separated only by fence and law and the invisible boundary of defeat. Some of them would remain in Australia after the war, making new lives in a country they had come to know only as enemies and prisoners. Some would return to Germany. All of them carried with them the strange burden of being, simultaneously, the best source of information about Sydney's end and the least capable of providing the certainty that desperate families craved. In the weeks that followed their rescue, as official inquiries began, as the Australian military began the grim process of understanding what had happened to one of their own ships, the accounts from the German survivors were collected, compared, analysed. But the simple, definitive answer to the central question, did Sydney sink immediately, or did she remain afloat? Did any man survive? Where exactly did she go down? Remained stubbornly out of reach. The ocean, it seemed, was keeping its secrets. The German men could testify to what they had seen from their rafts in the darkness. Everything beyond that was silence and absence, and the endless, patient depths of water that would hold the answer to these questions for 7 more decades, waiting with the kind of patience that only stone and ocean possess. And so the Indian Ocean had swallowed them both. Where Sydney was, nobody knew. Where she had gone in those final moments between the explosion and the darkness, whether she had limped away into the night trailing fire, whether she had slipped beneath the surface in minutes or hours, these questions remained locked beneath the water, unanswered and terrible in their silence. The news reached Perth first, then spread across the nation like a cold current. There had been a naval engagement off Shark Bay on the 19th of November. The enemy raider had been destroyed, scuttled by her own crew. But Sydney had not returned to port. Sydney was overdue. Sydney, the pride of Australia, the ship that had fought through the Mediterranean and returned home intact, that had been sent out to patrol her own waters and protect them, had simply vanished. The waiting began. Families gathered around wireless sets. Newspapers held their reports. Surely she would arrive. Surely there had been damage, an engine failure, a reason for her silence. Ships limped into harbour with engine trouble all the time. This was the war. There were explanations for everything, and explanations were what people needed. But no explanation came. Days passed. The harbour remained empty of her shape. The Navy released what information it could, cautious, official, wrapped in the careful language of wartime security. A raider had been engaged and sunk. But the details of Sydney's fate were locked away, classified, kept from view. This was standard practice during wartime, of course. Information was a weapon, and the enemy must not know the full cost of their victory. The public, however, lived in a different world. They lived in uncertainty, in the ache of not knowing. Weeks passed, and still nothing. No wreckage washed ashore. No lifeboats appeared on the coast. No sailors stumbled onto remote beaches with stories to tell. The Indian Ocean, that vast and indifferent stretch of water, had given up nothing. It was as though Sydney had not sunk at all, but simply ceased to exist, removed from the world entirely, leaving behind only the terrible mathematics of her absence. 645 men unaccounted for. 645 families waiting for news that would never come. The survivors of Kormoran, meanwhile, had been plucked from their lifeboats by Japanese ships and Australian vessels. They had stories. Their commander, Captain Theodore Detmers, had tales of the battle, of Sydney's approach, of the moment when the disguise fell away and the guns spoke across the water. The Germans told their version of events, how Sydney had closed in recklessly, how the opening salvo had been devastating, how the Australian ship had burned. They spoke of seeing her alight in the dusk, of watching her turn away, listing, but they had not seen her sink. They had not watched her go down. When darkness fell and the smoke cleared, Sydney was simply gone from their view, and they had their own survival to think of. Here was the cruelty of it. The Kormoran survivors could not answer the one question that mattered most to Australia. They could tell of the battle, yes, but the end of the story, the crucial, heartbreaking end, remained invisible to them. Perhaps Sydney had limped away. Perhaps she was crippled and drifting somewhere out in that vast ocean. Perhaps she was still afloat, still sending signals that no one received. Perhaps she had gone down quickly, and her final moments belonged only to those 645 men who could tell no one what they had witnessed. This uncertainty was a particular kind of torture for a nation at war. There were families who could not properly grieve because there was no final confirmation. There were widows who wondered if they were widows at all. There were mothers who held on to the thinnest thread of hope. What if he had been picked up by a neutral vessel? What if he had made it to an island? What if he was somewhere, somehow, alive? The absence of wreckage became almost worse than wreckage itself. At least wreckage was proof. At least wreckage was an ending. And so Sydney entered the realm of mystery. Not a minor puzzle to be solved in a few weeks, but a profound and national mystery, the kind that settles into the bones of a culture and stays there, aching through the decades. The Navy released official accounts. The press published what they were allowed to publish. Books were written. Theories emerged. But the truth, the actual, verified, documented truth of what happened in Sydney's final moments, remained submerged, as deep and as dark as the ocean floor itself. Families kept their vigils. The relatives of the dead sailors clung to each photograph, every letter, every small object that had survived while their men had not. In Australian schools, children learned that Sydney had been lost in action, and the bare facts of it became history, but never quite became complete history. It became a story with a hole in it, a narrative that ended in mid-sentence, a question that hung in the air of the nation's collective memory. The war continued. Other ships were lost. Other battles were fought. Time moved forward as it always does, but the mystery of Sydney did not fade with the years. It deepened. It became more precious. It became, in a very real sense, sacred. Not because anyone understood what had happened, but precisely because no one did, and because the uncertainty had become a kind of testimony itself, a permanent inscription of grief, written across the face of history. What if, we might ask in the quietness of this hour, the not knowing had been a kind of mercy? What if the details, had they been known immediately, would have been even more unbearable? These are the questions that rise unbidden when we sit with old sorrow, when we let ourselves feel the weight of secrets kept in the dark water, waiting. In those first hours and days after Sydney vanished, the Australian government faced a silence that was perhaps even more troubling than the loss itself. No radio signals emerged from her. No lifeboats appeared on the horizon with survivors clinging to wreckage. No distress calls were recorded in the communications logs that would normally capture the final moments of a warship in extremis. And so, in the absence of witnesses and evidence, the official machinery of wartime governance began to shape a narrative around what had happened out there in the November dusk. The Australian military command, in those early weeks, was itself uncertain. The Kormoran survivors had been rescued, eventually, by Japanese vessels and later transferred through neutral ports, but their accounts were slow to reach Australian intelligence. The German crew could offer pieces of the puzzle: the encounter, the fury of the battle, the sinking of their own ship, but they knew nothing definitive of Sydney's ultimate fate. Had she gone down immediately in those final moments of combat? Had she limped away, grievously wounded, and sunk in the deep water beyond the horizon? Had she somehow, impossibly, survived and limped toward a distant port. The uncertainty hung like fog over the investigation. But wartime, by its very nature, is a time of controlled information. Governments at war do not speak freely of their losses, particularly not losses as significant and symbolically damaging as the disappearance of a modern warship, with over 600 souls aboard. The Royal Australian Navy, in particular, had invested considerable prestige in the Sydney. She was not merely a vessel, she was a representation of Australian naval power, of the nation's capacity to defend its own waters. To admit that she had been destroyed, perhaps even deceived and destroyed, by a camouflaged German raider was to acknowledge vulnerabilities that would unsettle a population already stretched thin by the demands of global conflict. And so the initial official statements were carefully constructed. They were vague where precision might have revealed dangerous truths. They were hopeful where hope might have been a mercy, or perhaps a mercy masquerading as certainty. The public was told that Sydney had encountered an unidentified vessel. There had been an action. The circumstances remained under investigation, but the confident tone suggested that the matter would eventually be resolved, that there was no cause for unusual alarm, that the Navy remained vigilant and in control. Consider for a moment what this silence meant to those waiting at home. The families of the 645 men aboard Sydney received no immediate notification of their loss. They heard, instead, radio broadcasts and newspaper reports that spoke in careful language of a vessel in action, of investigations underway. Days passed, then weeks, and the vagueness began to curdle into something more ominous. Mothers and wives and fathers began to understand that if the Navy knew with certainty what had happened, they would say so. The careful language was itself a form of confession, an admission that the government did not know, and perhaps did not know in a way that was deeply embarrassing. But here is where the machinery of wartime secrecy intersected with something more dangerous: the public's hunger for answers, and the vacuum that official silence creates. In that vacuum, speculation began to grow. If the government was not saying everything, then perhaps there was something more to know. Perhaps the accounts were incomplete. Perhaps there were details that were being withheld for security reasons. Reasons that might eventually be revealed once the war was over, once it was safe to speak the full truth. Censorship during the Second World War was not a crude instrument. It was, in many ways, a sophisticated apparatus designed to balance military necessity with public morale. Information about shipping losses, for instance, was often suppressed or delayed, not out of simple secrecy, but out of the genuine concern that knowledge of the sinking would aid the enemy, or that it would demoralize the home front. A merchant ship sunk in one part of the Indian Ocean told the Japanese something about convoy routes and naval dispositions. Knowledge of that sinking, if broadly publicized, told the Australian people that the ocean was not safe, that losses were mounting, that perhaps the war was not going as well as official communiques suggested. The Sydney, however, was not a merchant vessel. She was a warship of considerable size and significance, and she had not simply sunk through enemy action. She had vanished. There was no wreckage, no survivors, no final radio transmission. The nature of her loss was itself classified information, for reasons both legitimate and less so. The legitimate reasons were straightforward. The Germans had successfully used a disguised raider to destroy an Australian warship. Revealing the full details of this success might encourage them to send other raiders, or it might demonstrate to the Japanese that such tactics were viable. But beneath that legitimate concern, there was also the matter of national pride, of institutional reputation, of the uncomfortable fact that the Sydney had been fooled, had been drawn into an ambush, had been destroyed by an enemy she did not initially recognize as an enemy. And this is where the seeds of later confusion and conspiracy were first planted. The wartime silence was, in many respects, necessary and defensible. But it was also incomplete and misleading, because it did not account for the fact that wartime does not last forever. After the war ended, those families who had lost loved ones aboard Sydney wanted answers. They wanted to know, in detail and with certainty, what had happened to their sons and brothers and husbands on that November evening. They had waited through years of war for the security classification to be lifted, for the truth to be revealed. But sometimes, when truth is delayed long enough, it becomes entangled with speculation and rumor. The families had spent years developing their own theories, reading between the lines of official reports, listening to the accounts of German survivors who had been released and who spoke to journalists. In the absence of a complete and early explanation, alternative narratives had taken root. If the government had told the story fully and immediately after the war, a single coherent account might have dominated the public understanding. Instead, there were gaps, and into those gaps flowed questions that seemed to grow larger rather than smaller as the years passed. The German account, for instance, suggested that the Sydney had been crippled and had sunk in the hours after the battle, possibly limping away into the darkness before going down. But without the evidence of a wreck, without the testimony of any survivors from Sydney herself, this remained speculation, albeit informed speculation. Some people wondered, in those post-war years, whether Sydney might have actually survived the battle. Might she have struggled back toward the coast? Might she have sunk not in the open ocean, but in shallower water, where she might be more easily located and explored? These were not the thoughts of cranks or conspiracy theorists, at least not initially. They were the reasonable questions of people who had been given incomplete information and who were left to fill in the blanks themselves. The machinery of wartime secrecy, which had been designed to serve legitimate military purposes, had inadvertently created the conditions under which doubt could flourish. The official silence had been protective in the moment, but it had become corrosive over time, breeding uncertainty and speculation, where a fuller, earlier accounting might have produced acceptance, however painful. And so in the decades that followed, as the families waited and researchers began quietly to ask questions, the Sydney mystery was not simply a historical puzzle to be solved. It was also a question about authority and transparency, about what governments owe to those who have lost loved ones, about the difference between secrecy in service of military necessity and secrecy that persists long after it serves any purpose at all. The years that followed November 1941 were years of profound absence. In the homes scattered across Australia, in Brisbane and Melbourne, in small towns along the coast, in rural valleys far from any ocean, 645 families sat with an emptiness that had no clear shape, not quite grief, not quite hope, but something suspended between them. There were no bodies to bury. There were no final letters discovered in uniform pockets. There was only silence, and the ocean's refusal to return what it had taken. The official story, delivered through wartime channels and censored newspapers, was thin. A ship had been lost. Enemy action had claimed her. The details remained classified, locked away in government files, and this secrecy itself became a kind of wound. When you are not told what happened to someone you love, the mind fills the silence with its own narratives, and those narratives can be more tormenting than truth. And so the waiting began. Not the sharp, focused waiting of those who know a search is underway, but a different kind. The slow, diffuse waiting of people who had no reason to believe anyone was looking at all. Australia's Navy, in those years immediately after the war, turned its attention to reconstruction, to new vessels, to the Cold War horizon that was already beginning to darken. The wrecks of the Kormoran and Sydney lay where they had fallen, somewhere in waters deeper than anyone could easily reach, their positions unknown, their fates unconfirmed. Yet even in that official silence, the searching began. It simply took forms that the government did not control or direct. Fishermen were the first keepers of the mystery. Men who worked the waters off Shark Bay and the Abrolhos Islands, who had known those seas for decades, brought back stories that passed from boat to boat, from pier to pub, accumulating the worn patina of often retold tales. Some claimed to have found debris, a piece of deck plating, a fragment of uniform, something that might have come from Sydney. Others spoke of seeing unusual underwater formations on their sonar, shapes that did not match the seabed's usual contours. These stories were not treated as evidence by any official body. They were whispers, folklore almost, the ocean giving up its secrets in the partial way that oceans do, never quite confirming, never quite denying. Among these fishermen, some became quietly obsessed. They spent their own money on equipment, bought navigation charts, spent hours studying the accounts that had finally begun to emerge from German survivors, interviews conducted after the war, accounts of where they believed the battle had taken place, descriptions of how far Sydney had steamed before she went down. These men were not scientists. They had no institutional backing, no university affiliation, no funding. What they had was stubbornness, and a peculiar intimacy with the sea itself, the kind that comes only from working it day after day, reading its moods, trusting its small revelations. Around the same time, amateur historians began their own quiet archaeology. They were often veterans themselves, or the sons and daughters of veterans, or simply people seized by the human need to understand an incomplete story. They gathered fragments of testimony. They collected the few official documents that had been declassified. They interviewed German officers who had survived and lived into old age, speaking with them through interpreters, listening to their accounts of the battle with an attention that no government body had quite devoted to the matter. These amateurs did something that official history had not yet done. They treated the question as urgent. They acted as though the answer mattered not just historically, but morally. To the 645 men who had disappeared, it mattered. To their families, it still mattered. And the families themselves were the true historians, though they did not always think of themselves in that way. They were mothers who had never seen their sons again after they marched onto the wharf in uniform. They were wives who became widows in an instant, with no body to mourn, no grave to visit. They were children who grew up knowing a father only through photographs and letters, through stories told by relatives who had themselves begun to doubt which details were memory and which were embellishment. These families carried the emotional weight of the mystery in ways that no researcher could fully document. It was a weight that could not be measured in archives or expressed in official reports, yet it was real and present, a gravitational force that shaped how they moved through their lives. Some of these families became devoted to understanding what had happened. In the 1960s and 70s, as Australia's post-war confidence began to settle into a more complex historical reckoning, they began to ask questions publicly. Why had no search been mounted? Why did the government seem unwilling to provide clear answers? Why was the story of Sydney's loss treated differently from other naval losses? There was no conspiracy here, at least not in any dramatic sense, only the ordinary bureaucratic tendency to file things away and move forward. But to families waiting for closure, that bureaucratic distance felt like a kind of abandonment. The mystery deepened as the decades passed, not because new evidence emerged, but because the absence of evidence itself became conspicuous. It was unusual, in 20th century naval history, for a major warship to simply disappear with no wreckage ever found, no confirmed sighting of her final resting place. Where was Sydney? The Kormoran's position seemed to have been established through survivor accounts, at least approximately. But Sydney had steamed into the night after the battle, and the ocean had closed over her completely. The not knowing became its own kind of presence, a shape that absence took in the Australian imagination. There were theories, of course. Some whispered that Sydney had been found long ago, but the government kept it secret. Others suggested that she had travelled much farther than anyone believed before sinking, lost in waters where no one thought to look. A few even entertained the thought that she had somehow survived, that some sailors had made it to distant shores and chosen not to return, though this required such a profound bending of plausibility that it lived in the realm of wish rather than serious speculation. But even implausible theories, when they circulate through communities of grief, carry their own kind of truth. They keep attention focused. They prevent the disappearance from becoming absolute. Into this landscape of wondering, amateurs and professionals alike continued their slow work. A retired naval officer might spend weekends combing through newly declassified documents. A historian might travel to Germany to interview aging men who had served on Kormoran, capturing their memories before time erased them entirely. Fishermen continued to report their observations, and while each individual sighting might be dismissed as inconclusive, together they created a rough map of where to look, a geography of possibility. The families, meanwhile, kept the remembrance alive in their own ways. November 19th became a date of particular significance, a moment when attention turned back to 1941, when the loss was commemorated in ceremonies and gatherings, when the names of the 645 were spoken aloud. In one sense, this ritual could seem futile. It did not recover bodies. It did not explain what had happened, but ritual has its own logic and its own necessity. To gather and remember is to say that these absences matter. It is to insist that these 645 young men were not simply erased, that their disappearance was not the final word. And so the decades accumulated. The 1950s became the 1960s, the 1960s the 1970s and beyond. Technology advanced around the question without quite answering it. Sonar became more sophisticated. Deep-sea exploration became less the realm of science fiction and more a realistic possibility. But the wreck of Sydney remained unlocated, remaining stubbornly hidden in waters where few had the means to search, and fewer still possessed the patience for a search that might yield nothing. Yet each time a new technological capability emerged, the question was renewed. If we can now reach depths that were once unreachable, might we finally know? If we have better instruments, better maps, better understanding of ocean currents and drift patterns, might we be able to solve this riddle at last? The waiting transformed, across those decades, from a passive state into something more like anticipation. The mystery shifted from feeling like an eternal condition to feeling like something that could, perhaps, be answered, if only the right expedition were mounted, if only the right funding could be found, if only the will existed to finally look. The families who waited through those decades, holding on to unanswered questions, could not have imagined the technology that would eventually slip beneath the waves on their behalf. But the world was quietly changing in ways that had nothing to do with history or remembrance. It was changing in the language of sound, of mathematics, of machines learning to see in absolute darkness. Sonar, that extraordinary listening device born from the urgency of war itself, had evolved far beyond its original purpose of detecting submarines in shallow coastal waters. The principle remained beautifully simple. A sound wave travels through water, bounces off an object, and returns to tell a story about what lies below. But by the latter decades of the 20th century, those sound waves had become incomparably more refined, more precise, capable of reading the seafloor with an almost intimate clarity. Where once sonar could merely announce the presence of something large, modern systems could whisper details about shape, about texture, about the particular way a sunken vessel had settled into the sediment after decades of silent rest. The Indian Ocean, that vast and mostly unknowable expanse, had kept its secrets partly because the technology to pursue them did not exist. The waters off Western Australia, where Sydney and Kormoran had met in violence, dropped away into depths that made traditional salvage operations little more than expensive fantasies. To search at such depths required resources that had to be carefully justified, meticulously planned, and coordinated across governments and institutions with patience that seemed almost incompatible with human nature. Yet it was precisely this challenge that eventually drew the attention of people who had made it their life's work to read the ocean's depths. Deep sea mapping, that patient cartography of the world's most hidden places, had become not merely possible, but necessary as the 20th century turned toward its final decades. Oil companies drilling in deep water needed to know what lay beneath them. Military navies studying ocean currents required detailed bathymetric maps, precise measurements of water depth and seafloor contours. Scientists investigating the geology of continental shelves and abyssal plains began accumulating vast libraries of acoustic data, pixel by pixel, measurement by measurement, until the seafloor itself began to emerge from its ancient obscurity. 1. And embedded within all this technological infrastructure, all this data collection driven by commerce and strategy, lay the possibility of finding things that were never meant to be found again. Shipwreck archaeology, as a discipline, had existed for generations, but it had lived mostly in shallower waters, in the Mediterranean, where the remains of ancient vessels rested within reach of divers, within sight of sunlight. The deeper ships, the great losses of modern warfare, the vessels that had sunk in places where human beings could not survive, those remained beyond the scope of archaeological study. They belonged to the realm of mystery, to historical records and survivor testimony, to the slow accumulation of questions that could never quite be answered. But what if that boundary itself could be moved? The development of remotely operated vehicles, machines that could descend to the deepest trenches without carrying human life, without requiring the enormous infrastructure of a crude submersible, changed the equation entirely. These ROVs, as they came to be called, could be fitted with cameras of extraordinary sensitivity, with manipulator arms that could handle artifacts with care, with sensors that could gather data about everything their lenses observed. They were, in essence, an extension of human curiosity reaching down into places the human body could never go. Eyes that could see in darkness, hands that could work in pressure that would crush conventional machinery. Think for a moment about what this meant. The technology that could map entire ocean basins, the instruments that could detect a small shipwreck in thousands of square kilometers of water, the machines that could descend to those depths and document what lay there. All of these elements had been developed largely in isolation, for different purposes, without any deliberate intention to solve the Sydney and Kormoran mystery. Yet they existed, scattered across research institutions and naval agencies and private companies, waiting to be assembled into a coordinated effort. The path toward that assembly was neither straight nor swift. It required political will from two nations whose conflict in the 1940s had meant life and death, but whose cooperation in the 21st century could now be directed toward remembrance rather than warfare. It required funding that had to be justified to people who might reasonably ask why searching for a ship that sank more than 60 years ago was a worthwhile investment of resources. It required experts from multiple disciplines, oceanographers who understood the physics of deep water, historians who could interpret archival records to estimate where the search should begin, engineers who could design equipment to operate at depths where the water pressure measured in tons per square inch, archaeologists trained in the careful documentation of scenes that could only be observed once. And it required something less tangible but perhaps more essential, a collective decision that this mystery mattered, that the families still waiting deserved answers, that the sailors who had disappeared into darkness so long ago were worth finding. The technology itself told a quiet story about human progress, about our slowly expanding ability to reach into the unknown and retrieve it. Sonar had evolved from the desperate innovation of wartime necessity into the precise instrument of peacetime investigation. Mapping technology, driven by commerce and military strategy, had created the detailed bathymetric charts that could narrow the search area from thousands of square kilometers to a manageable expanse. And the remotely operated vehicles, machines that seemed like science fiction merely decades earlier, had become reliable tools capable of traveling to the seafloor and working there with patient, methodical precision. Yet for all this advancement, all this accumulated capability, the ocean still demanded respect. It still required that those who sought to unveil its secrets approach with humility, understanding that the technology was merely the means, and that the goal, to find what had been lost, to answer what had long been silent, remained fundamentally human. By the early 2000s, the mystery had begun to shift in character. It was no longer the exclusive property of official inquiries and naval historians. Families wanted answers, descendants wanted to know, and the technology itself had finally matured enough to reach down into the deepest places where the wrecks might rest. The ocean floor in that region of the Indian Ocean, where Sydney and Kormoran had met in violence 80 years before, sits at varying depths. Some areas shallow enough for conventional diving, others plunging to over 800 meters, where the pressure turns the darkness absolute and the cold becomes a presence almost tangible even through the metal of a research vessel's hull. In 2008, an expedition was organized with deliberate care, combining Australian naval historians, oceanographers, and specialist wreck search teams, people who had spent lifetimes learning to read the language of the seafloor through sound waves and digital imaging. The search itself was not dramatic, at least not in the traditional sense. There would be no sudden discovery at the moment of setting out, no miraculous finding on the first day. Instead, what unfolded was methodical, patient, almost meditative in its rhythm, the very antithesis of the violent encounter it was meant to illuminate. The research vessel positioned itself within the search grid, that imaginary rectangle of ocean they had calculated based on survivor testimonies, historical records of currents, and the physics of where two damaged ships might have drifted before sinking. Sonar equipment was lowered through the water column, equipment sensitive enough to detect the shape of a wreck, to distinguish the hard geometry of metal and machinery from the soft folds of the seabed itself. The ship would move forward slowly, methodically, in straight lines, back and forth across the grid, like someone mowing a vast and invisible field, while above, in the control room, researchers watched screens displaying the acoustic echoes returning from below. There is something almost hypnotic about sonar work, if you listen to accounts of those who conduct it. The pinging of the equipment, the steady collection of data points, the slow accumulation of a picture that begins formless and gradually resolves into something recognizable. It requires patience that borders on meditative, hours of movement across empty water, intervals of waiting, the knowledge that at any moment the instruments might return a shape that is not rock, not sand, not the natural topography of the deep, but the remains of human intention, a ship that once carried living people, now sunken and silent. The Kormoran, being the smaller vessel, was the first to reveal itself. When the sonar image resolved sufficiently for the team to recognize what they were seeing, there must have been a moment of stillness, a kind of held breath. The shape on the screen matched the dimensions they expected, the hull of a merchant raider that had been scuttled deliberately as her crew abandoned her, sent to the bottom by her own officers to deny her capture. She rested at a depth of around 640 meters, her orientation telling its own quiet story. The wreck lay on the seafloor, with its hull relatively intact, tilted slightly, a monument to those final hours when German sailors had opened her seacocks and sealed her compartments one final time, then climbed into lifeboats and left her to sink into darkness. Confirmation came through imaging systems far more sophisticated than simple sonar, photogrammetry. The creation of three-dimensional models from digital photographs allowed researchers to map the wreck with extraordinary precision, to see damage patterns, to understand how the ship had gone down. There she was, after 67 years of obscurity, of being lost in a metaphorical sense, even though her approximate position had been known. The Kormoran was found, a ship once used for commerce, then transformed into an instrument of war, then deliberately destroyed by those she had served. Now she was merely data, a shape on a screen, a story made visible again. Yet the discovery of Kormoran, while significant, was in some sense only the beginning. The research team faced a peculiar psychological shift after finding her. There was, of course, professional satisfaction, the validation of their search methodology, and their historical calculations. But Sydney was the ship that had drawn this entire enterprise forward, the mystery that had haunted Australian consciousness for 7 decades. Kormoran was found, but where was Sydney? The German ship's fate had been known, at least in outline, for years. But the Australian cruiser, the pride of the nation, the vessel that had disappeared with all hands, leaving no wreckage on the surface, no survivors to tell her final tale, Sydney remained elusive, perhaps even deeper, perhaps scattered across an even wider section of the seafloor. The search grid was expanded, the sonar patterns extended outward in ever-widening arcs. Days passed, sometimes with little to show but negative results, the seafloor returning its acoustic signatures, the ship's computers recording and filing away information that led nowhere. There is a particular kind of patience required in deep-sea search work, a willingness to accept that vast expenditures of time and effort might yield nothing for hours on end. The researchers moved their vessel across the Indian Ocean, back and forth, in systematic lines, guided by calculations that attempted to account for currents, drifting distances, the behavior of a damaged ship taking water, the physics of sinking. How long does it take for a ship to sink, really, when she is mortally wounded and her crew has abandoned her? The answer depends on countless factors: the size of the holes in her hull, where those holes are located, how much watertight integrity remains, whether she breaks apart as she descends or sinks intact. Sydney, smaller than Kormoran in terms of displacement, had been ravaged by cannon fire at devastatingly close range. She would have gone down relatively quickly perhaps, or perhaps she drifted for a time, burning, crippled, her engines failing, before the water finally overwhelmed her systems and she began her long descent into darkness. Then came the moment that had been anticipated for so long. A signal returned that was not the seafloor, not a natural formation, but the unmistakable signature of a wreck. There, on the sonar display, revealed itself the shape of HMAS Sydney II, the ship that had carried 645 souls into the final battle. She lay at a depth even greater than Kormoran, resting in darkness so complete that no ray of sunlight had ever penetrated to her position. The coordinates were recorded, the data was confirmed, and for the first time in more than 60 years, the Australian people knew where their lost ship had come to rest. The Kormoran had been found, resting at just over 100 meters down, her wreckage scattered across the seafloor in a pattern that told its own story of violence and surrender. But the search teams knew they were not finished. They had found the raider. Now they needed to find the hunted, the ship that had struck back even as she was being torn apart by gunfire in the fading Australian light. The search continued into November of that year, the sonar operators maintaining their patient, methodical sweeps across the coordinates where Sydney had last been seen, where she had vanished into darkness with all 645 souls aboard her. The seafloor in these waters is not a gentle slope. Depth changes suddenly, dramatically. The Australian continental shelf falls away with little warning, and Sydney had gone down far deeper than the Kormoran, sinking into waters that swallowed her more completely, hiding her in an abyss that had kept her secret for nearly 70 years. When the sonar finally caught her, the first images were indistinct, shadowed by distance and the murk of deep water. But as the equipment refined its resolution, refined it again, a shape emerged from the darkness on the screens above. Not scattered wreckage, not a random accumulation of debris. A ship, intact, unmistakable. The moment itself, when the operators realized what they were seeing, must have carried weight different from the discovery of the Kormoran. This was not an enemy vessel. This was an Australian ship. This was home. The images showed Sydney lying on her side, resting at a depth of over 200 meters, far below the sunlit world, in a place of perpetual cold and silence where she had lain untouched, preserved by the deep water for nearly 7 decades. Her hull had not disintegrated. Her structure had not crumbled to rubble. She lay there still recognizable, still dignified in some strange way, a tomb and a monument at once. When the first photographs arrived on the surface, brought up from the darkness by unmanned submersibles equipped with cameras, there was a particular poignancy in what the images revealed. The damage was immediately apparent. The port side of her hull bore the scarring of concentrated gunfire, shell impacts that had torn through steel, leaving ragged wounds in the metal that had carried her through battles in the Mediterranean, that had been her shield and her identity. The pattern of the damage told a story that corroborated what the German survivors had reported all those years before, what the official inquiry had eventually pieced together from fragments of testimony. Sydney had been hit repeatedly from close range. The Kormoran's gunners had been accurate, and they had been merciless. But there was more in those underwater photographs than mere confirmation. There was evidence of the desperation of Sydney's final moments. Her superstructure bore signs of the fire that had raged through her decks, consuming her in flames that had climbed into the darkening sky. The officers would have known, in those last minutes, that she could not be saved. The fire was consuming her. The hull was compromised. The ship that had been their home, their workplace, their identity as sailors, was dying beneath their feet. And yet she had fought. Even as she burned, even as the water began to pour in through her wounds, she had continued to return fire, continued to strike back at the Kormoran, until both ships were crippled, until both were lost. The deeper questions, the ones that had haunted historians for decades, remained largely unanswered by the wreck itself. Sydney's captain, Captain John Collins, and the senior officers who might have provided clarity about the ship's final decisions, about the precise sequence of events in those terrible minutes, had gone down with her. There were no survivors from Sydney, no voices from her decks to explain what the last orders had been, or if there had been any attempt to abandon ship, or how many of her crew had perished in the fire versus the sinking. The wreck preserved the physical evidence of what had happened, but it could not speak to the human experience of those moments. Yet the wreck also revealed details that had been debated and disputed for nearly 7 decades. The position where she lay, far from the Kormoran's final resting place, showed the direction in which she had drifted after the battle, the currents that had carried her deeper before she finally went under. The orientation of her hull suggested how she had capsized as she sank, the sequence in which she had taken on water. These details, though technical, though seemingly distant from the raw human tragedy, served a purpose. They allowed the families of the lost sailors, the Australian people who had mourned without answers, to begin to understand what had happened to their ship, to know something concrete about her final journey. The discovery also raised, in a quiet way, a different kind of question. What would the wreck preserve of human history? In the cold, undisturbed waters, Organic material degrades very slowly. Photographs from the submersibles showed objects still in place on Sydney's decks, equipment undisturbed by time in the way it would have been if the ship rested in warmer, more active water. It was a preservation that was both beautiful and haunting. The wreck was a time capsule, frozen in the moment of catastrophe. But the families of the lost men also understood that this time capsule was a grave. 645 bodies had gone down with that ship. They rested in that darkness, held by the water, surrounded by the vessel that had been their second home. The search had been vindicated. The decades of effort, the technological advances that had made the discovery possible, the patience of researchers who had refused to let the mystery remain unsolved, had borne fruit. Sydney had been found. The story that had seemed incomplete, that had been shrouded in mystery and loss, now had a conclusion. Not an explanation of everything. Mysteries remained about the precise sequence of events, about whether Sydney might have survived if different decisions had been made, about the final moments in the darkness. But a conclusion nonetheless. The ship had been found. Her story had been told, not in complete detail, but in the broad strokes that mattered. She had fought, she had been overwhelmed, and she had sunk into the deep. The seafloor photographs that emerged from the research submersibles in those dark hours of 2008 told a story that human survivors could never quite articulate with certainty. When the Kormoran's wreck came into view on the sonar screens, her hull lay at a depth of around 240 meters, resting on her side in a posture that spoke of her final moments with silent clarity. The German raider's structure was fractured, twisted by the violence of her scuttling and the immense pressure of decades spent in the abyss, yet certain details remained discernible to the trained eyes studying the imagery. The damage patterns visible on her hull corresponded precisely with the historical accounts given by her survivors. The shell strikes from Sydney's guns, the fires that had consumed her decks, the deliberate flooding that sent her down rather than allow capture. What the photographs revealed was almost a confirmation whispered across 70 years of silence. The shell holes, the ruptures in her plating, the burn marks still visible on what remained of her superstructure, all aligned with the sequence of events as the German crew had described them. This was not conjecture or debate. This was evidence, physical and undeniable, embedded in the seafloor sediment. Kormoran had indeed received the punishment that Sydney delivered in those final, ferocious minutes. And yet, standing before this evidence, historians found themselves contemplating a peculiar truth. Confirmation of what happened to the raider did not necessarily illuminate what happened to the light cruiser herself. The wreck of HMAS Sydney was discovered some days later, resting at a considerably greater depth, approximately 2,000 meters below the surface, far deeper and considerably more distant from the site of Kormoran than the official records had previously suggested. This discovery, in itself, carried profound implications. Sydney had drifted substantially farther than anyone had calculated, burning through the night, her trajectory carrying her away from the crippled German vessel in a way that spoke to the violence and chaos of her final hours. The distance between the two wrecks became a kind of silent testament to the ferocity of that exchange, to the way explosions and fires and listing hulls had carried the two damaged ships in different directions through the darkness. When the submersible cameras finally penetrated the gloom and illuminated Sydney's form, what emerged was a vessel that bore the unmistakable signature of catastrophic violence. Her superstructure was devastated. The gun turrets that had served her so faithfully in the Mediterranean were now twisted and tilted at unnatural angles. Her decks were warped and ruptured. There was a kind of terrible eloquence in her destruction, a physical narrative of the battle that no survivor could have witnessed, because no survivor had lived to see it. But what became apparent, what the imagery could confirm beyond dispute, was that Sydney had suffered damage consistent with the close-range bombardment delivered by Kormoran's hidden armament. The pattern of hits, the distribution of structural failure, the way certain sections had been cleaved from the hull, all of this painted a picture of a ship overwhelmed by firepower at devastatingly intimate range. Yet here lay the curious incompleteness that would trouble historians and descendants alike, even in the face of these extraordinary discoveries. While the wrecks confirmed that both ships had indeed engaged in battle, while the physical evidence corroborated the sequence of events as remembered by survivors, certain questions of profound human significance remained stubbornly unanswered. How precisely had all 645 men aboard Sydney perished? What was the exact sequence of events in those final hours after the firing ceased and darkness fell? Did Sydney sink from the accumulated damage of Cormoran's shells, or did she remain afloat longer than anyone supposed, drifting burning through the night until her end came from internal explosions or structural collapse? The wrecks, in their silence, could not speak to these details. The physical evidence confirmed the violence, yes, but it could not restore voices or actions, or the small individual moments of human experience that make a tragedy complete rather than merely documented. It could not tell whether men fought with courage or terror or resignation. It could not explain the strange absence of wreckage in the water, the lack of lifeboats, the complete and utter silence that had greeted all rescue attempts in the days following. Cormoran's survivors, recovered by passing vessels, had provided accounts of what they witnessed, but their perspective was bounded by darkness, by shock, by the natural limitations of human perception in moments of catastrophe. They had seen Sydney burning, they had heard her guns, but they had not witnessed her final moments, and no one ever would. The seafloor evidence offered its own kind of testimony, but it was a testimony written in the language of structure and damage and decay, not in the language of human experience. The photographs showed where the shells had struck, the patterns of heat and pressure and destruction, the way the two vessels had broken apart under forces that exceeded their design specifications. This was invaluable. This was transformative, but it was also, in a certain sense, incomplete. Science had answered some of the enduring questions, while raising others that perhaps no amount of future technology could ever fully resolve. What emerged from this pairing of discoveries? The Kormoran confirmed and damaged exactly as survivors had reported, and Sydney destroyed in a manner consistent with the historical accounts but still somehow mysterious in her final hours, was a kind of humbling recognition. The ocean had preserved the wreck sites with remarkable fidelity, keeping them intact enough that their stories could be read. But the ocean had also kept certain secrets. The pressure that had preserved Kormoran had also crushed the personal artifacts, the documents, the small remains that might have told the human story within the military history. The depth that sheltered Sydney had also placed her beyond the reach of human imagination, had made her distant in a way that no photograph could fully bridge. The battle damage patterns themselves became a subject of careful analysis, measured against the testimonies and the known specifications of the weapons involved. The German raiders' 6-inch guns, firing from such close range at a target unprepared for battle, had delivered damage that was both remarkable in its intensity and precisely what one would expect from that caliber of weapon at that distance. Sydney's answering fire, delivered once her identity was revealed and her own guns engaged, had been equally devastating in its way. Two heavily armed vessels, one of them surprised and vulnerable, had exchanged fire with a fury that left both mortally wounded. The pattern was consistent, the evidence aligned, and yet the human drama, the specific moments of decision and reaction and fear and duty that had unfolded between the first shots and the final surrender to the sea, remained forever locked away in silence. And so, in the decades that followed the discovery of these two ships, their hulls finally speaking to a history that had been silent for so long, something unexpected began to unfold on the surface of the world above. The waters that held them, those cold, dark waters of the Indian Ocean, became not a place of accusation or blame, but something altogether different, something shared. When the wrecks were found, they carried with them the weight of two nations' grief, yes. The Australian families, who had waited through years of uncertainty and speculation, finally found a place to direct their remembrance. Here, at these coordinates off Western Australia, was where their loved ones had fallen. The mystery had been solved, at least partly, and in that solving, something else had shifted. The wound could begin, perhaps, to be acknowledged, to be honoured. But here is where the story takes a gentler turn. Because Australia, in those years following 1941, had not only mourned its losses in isolation. Across the world in Germany, there were other families. There were the families of the men of the Kormoran, men who had also lost brothers, sons, husbands, in that brief, violent encounter off Shark Bay. For decades, those stories too had been buried, overshadowed by the larger narratives of war and victory and defeat. The German sailors had their own mystery to contend with, their own need to understand what had happened that evening when their ship's secret was revealed. The finding of both wrecks, then, represented something remarkable. It was a moment when two nations, separated by war and time and the accumulated weight of history, could finally look at the same evidence, could finally stand together, in a manner of speaking, over the grave they shared. Australian naval historians and German researchers began to collaborate in ways that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier. The wrecks themselves became a kind of common language. Here was damage that told stories, the angle of the shell strikes, the burn patterns, the way the metal had twisted and buckled under the force of the explosions. These were facts that transcended nationality. These were simply facts. The physics of destruction, the evidence of courage, the imprint of those final moments preserved in the seafloor's sediment. What began to emerge through this shared investigation was a deeper understanding of what those men had experienced. Both the men of Sydney and the men of Kormoran, not as enemies in the abstract sense, but as sailors, as human beings who had been caught in the machinery of a global conflict. The men of the Sydney, going about their patrol duties with no knowledge of the transformation that awaited them. The men of the Kormoran, knowing they were disguised, knowing danger was their constant companion, but perhaps not quite prepared for the ferocity of the engagement that would find them. In Australia, memorials began to take new form. The National War Memorial acknowledged the wreck's location. Ceremonies were held each year on November 19th, the anniversary of the sinking. These were solemn occasions, but they were also occasions that began to include recognition of the German sailors who had died as well. Not as enemies commemorated, but as men who had fallen in war, who had families who grieved them, who deserved to be remembered with the same dignity as those who had worn the Australian uniform. The Australian-German friendship that grew from this shared history was quiet, but genuine. It was the kind of reconciliation that doesn't announce itself loudly, but rather unfolds in small gestures, in collaborative research efforts, in the exchange of historical documents, in German sailors' descendants visiting Australian shores, and Australian families learning the names of the men who had served aboard the Kormoran. There are, even today, memorial services conducted in both nations. In Australia, the families of Sydney's sailors gather, often near the coast, looking out toward the waters where their relatives came to rest. In Germany, there are quieter remembrances, perhaps less visible to the wider world, but no less profound. The men of the Kormoran have their own honoured place in German naval history, and their sacrifice, for it was indeed a sacrifice, whatever one makes of the larger context of their service, is acknowledged. The ocean floor, that deep abyss where the two wrecks now rest in their final arrangement, has become a kind of shared cemetery. It is neutral ground, in a way that land memorials can never quite be. There is no question of which flag flies over it, because no flag can exist at those depths. There is only the physical fact of the ships themselves, the material evidence of that November evening, and the thousands of meters of water above that belong to no nation. Some of the relatives and descendants have spoken, in recent years, of making a kind of pilgrimage together, Australian and German families standing side by side aboard research vessels, looking down at those images transmitted from the deep. Imagine that moment, the screen illuminating the shape of a ship's hull, the recognition, finally, of where a grandmother's husband had disappeared, the quiet understanding that somewhere nearby, in the same waters, another family's loss was also being honored. What strikes many who have studied this shared history is how the two wrecks complement each other in remembrance. They are not trophies of victory, neither ship represents a triumph. Both are monuments to loss, to the chaos of war, to the moment when two sets of sailors collided in darkness. Perhaps that is why they have come to be remembered together, not in opposition, but in a kind of tragic duet. The reconciliation between Australia and Germany, that began in the post-war years, had many chapters, many formal diplomatic moments, and economic ties, and cultural exchanges. But there is something uniquely moving about the way these two sunken ships became part of that reconciliation. They represent not a conclusion to enmity, but an acknowledgement of shared humanity, a recognition that the men on both sides were not so different from one another. And as we contemplate this slow journey from warfare to remembrance, from mystery to understanding, from national grief to shared mourning, there emerges a larger meditation on what it means to remember, what it means to honor loss, what it means to stand with those who were once enemies over a common grave, and to recognize that the ocean holds all of us with equal indifference, that the depths do not distinguish between nations, between sides of a war long ended. The story of the Kormoran and the Sydney, then, is not only a story of a single naval encounter. It is a story of how history itself can be transformed through the act of understanding, how two nations can move from the question of who was right or who was wrong to the deeper, more human question of what happened and who do we remember here. That transformation is still unfolding, in archives and in archives, in family conversations, in the annual ceremonies, in the slow work of historians, and the quiet visits of descendants to these places of memory. The two wrecks continue to speak to us, in their way, of loss and reconciliation, of mystery slowly revealing itself, and of the strange grace that can emerge when we finally decide to remember together. There are places on the ocean floor where time moves differently, where currents drift slowly over steel, and silence settles like silt, and the weight of history becomes something you can almost feel in the darkness, pressing gently down. The Kormoran and HMAS Sydney rest now in waters off Western Australia, separated by distance and depth, yet bound together by an afternoon in November that neither crew could have imagined would define their memory forever. The discovery of their wrecks did not erase what was unknown. It only changed the shape of the mystery. We know now where they lay. We know the angle of their final resting, the pattern of the metal torn by shells and fire, the way the ocean has claimed them into its slow custody. But there remain questions that no sonar image can fully answer. Questions about the last moments, about what passed between men who knew they were dying, about whether anyone aboard Sydney understood what was happening, or if the end came so swiftly that understanding never quite arrived at all. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson the wrecks have taught us, that some things, even when found, remain partially lost. Even when we map every contour and measure every depth, The human experience of those final hours lives in a place beyond our reach. It persists in the silence between the steel beams, in the spaces where bodies once moved and now only darkness dwells. The wreckage confirms facts about what happened to the ships, but it cannot tell us what the men were thinking. It cannot translate the language of fear or courage that filled those ships in their last moments. And perhaps that absence of complete knowledge is itself something worth holding close. Perhaps the ocean keeps some stories to itself not as a punishment, but as a kind of mercy, a boundary between the historical record and the deeply personal. The families who lost 645 sailors aboard Sydney spent decades with empty graves and no certainty. That ache was real. That absence shaped lives. But when the wreck was finally found, resting at such profound depths that human eyes could only reach it through cameras and instruments, there came a different kind of solace. Not an answer that erased their grief, but a physical location where grief could rest, where the lost became locatable, where an entire nation could direct their remembrance toward a specific place on the map. The Kormoran's crew, adrift in their boats that November night, survived by chance, by the darkness that fell, by the nearness of rescue, by elements beyond their control that granted them life while granting others only the cold ocean. They would spend the rest of their lives knowing this, living with the knowledge that the same sea that took one ship spared another. That fate, or fortune, or whatever force governs such moments, divided them from death by hours and circumstance. We speak now of the Kormoran Sydney engagement as a single historical event, a puzzle that was solved when the wrecks were found. We fold it into the larger narrative of the Second World War, a naval engagement in the grand sweep of conflict, and all of that is true and necessary. But something gentler lives alongside the history, something that exists in the space between nations that were once enemies, and now, decades later, share a common memorial beneath the waves. Germany and Australia, bound not by alliance but by loss, by the understanding that beneath all conflict there are humans, crews, men with families waiting for them, men who never came home. When you visit the memorial to Sydney's lost in Western Australia, you encounter something quiet, not a celebration of military power, though there is respect for the ship's service. Instead, there is a kind of acknowledgement, an admission that the ocean took something irreplaceable, and that acknowledgement itself has become sacred. In the quiet of such places, you understand that remembrance is not about recovering what was lost, but it is about refusing to let loss be forgotten. It is about creating a place, whether physical or in the geography of memory, where the dead can remain present in the minds of the living. The ocean, in all its vastness, is not an empty place. It is a repository, a place where human ambitions and human stories sink beneath the surface but do not disappear. The currents move around them. The pressure of the depths does not crush their significance. Instead, it preserves it. The wrecks of the Kormoran and HMAS Sydney sit now in that custody, held by the ocean as though it were a kind of museum, a place where history rests not on shelves but on the sea floor, where it can be visited by machines and minds, where it can be honored without being disturbed. Some historians continue to ask questions about what exactly happened in those final minutes. Why did the two ships engage so closely? Whether Sydney's captain fully understood the danger, or whether command decisions reflected the information available in the moment, whether different choices might have changed the outcome. These are the questions that live in the margins of what we know. They are not mysteries born of missing evidence, but rather the natural texture of human events. No matter how much we discover, there remains a gap between the objective record and the lived experience of those who were there. And this is perhaps the most profound mystery of all. Not what happened to the ships, but what it meant to be aboard them. what the Kormoran's crew felt when they lowered their false flag and revealed their guns, what the officers and men aboard Sydney experienced in those terrible moments of discovery and realization. We can imagine, but we cannot know. We can honor that unknowing by admitting it honestly, by refusing to pretend that the finding of the wrecks has given us complete knowledge. The families of the lost have had to learn to live with this too, with the fact that their loved ones rest now in a place that is documented, catalogued, and protected, yet fundamentally inaccessible to them. You cannot visit a grave at 3,000 meters beneath the surface. You cannot leave flowers there or speak words of goodbye in a place where your voice cannot travel. Instead, remembrance becomes an act of imagination. It becomes a choice to keep someone present in your thoughts, to refuse their erasure even as the years accumulate and living memory fades. In the decades since the battle, the world has changed profoundly. The technologies that eventually found those wrecks would have seemed like science fiction to the men who served aboard them. The way we understand naval warfare, the way we map the ocean, the very concept of memorializing the war dead has evolved. Yet the fundamental mystery at the heart of the Kormoran-Sydney engagement remains unchanged. It is the mystery of how quickly life can change, how briefly the moment between safety and catastrophe can last, how the ordinary routines of a naval vessel, the watch being kept, the signals being sent, the steady progression of hours, can transform in an instant into something terrible. The ocean has always kept secrets. Long before recorded history, ships were lost in its depths, and their stories were forgotten or absorbed into mythology. But modernity has given us the tools to recover some of those stories, to bring them back to the surface, not in body, but in data and image and historical understanding. We use sonar and submersibles and archaeological method to reach into the deep places and confirm what happened there, and in doing so, we participate in a kind of conversation with the past. We speak across the decades and say, "We remember you, your story matters, your loss will not be unmourned." The night that Sydney went down was dark and cold. The fires that burned on her deck cast light across the water for a time, and then they were extinguished, either by the water itself or by the end of the ship. Those who might have survived the battle faced the same darkness that closed around the Kormoran's lifeboats, the same indifferent ocean that had no allegiance, no understanding of which flag a ship carried or which nation claimed its crew. The ocean simply was. It received what was given to it and held it in the slow, patient way that geological time permits. And now, as you rest with this story, as your mind begins to drift towards sleep, you might think about what it means to be remembered, what it means for a mystery to be partially solved and still somehow remain. The Kormoran and Sydney are found, but their deepest secrets rest still in the darkness. The men who served aboard them are honored now by two nations, by memorials and ceremonies, and stories told softly over years. They are gone, but they are not erased. They are held in the ocean's custody, and in the custody of human memory, which is perhaps the deeper ocean of all. The waters off Western Australia continue their endless movement. The currents shift and turn, driven by forces that have shaped the ocean for millions of years. The wrecks lie quietly beneath them, slowly being covered by sediment, slowly becoming part of the sea floor itself. In another 100 years, another 1,000, they will have sunk deeper still into the geological record. But for now, they are still there, still discoverable, still capable of speaking to us about who we were and what we are capable of losing. When sleep comes, and your thoughts begin to dissolve into the gentler currents of dreaming, perhaps you will carry with you the image of that vast